Released in 2014, Interstellar stands as one of the most ambitious and influential science fiction films of the 21st century. Directed by acclaimed filmmaker Christopher Nolan, who co-wrote the screenplay with his brother Jonathan Nolan, the film combines emotional storytelling, scientific theory, philosophical questions, and breathtaking visual spectacle into a cinematic experience that continues to captivate audiences around the world. Rather than presenting science fiction as simple entertainment filled with futuristic technology and action, Interstellar explores profound themes such as love, sacrifice, survival, the passage of time, and humanity's relentless desire to explore the unknown. Its blend of hard science with deeply emotional character-driven storytelling helped distinguish it from many other science fiction films of its era. The film features an impressive ensemble cast led by Academy Award winner Matthew McConaughey as Joseph Cooper, a former NASA pilot turned farmer who reluctantly embarks on humanity's most important mission. Joining him are Anne Hathaway as Dr. Amelia Brand, Jessica Chastain as Murph Cooper, Bill Irwin as the voice of the robot TARS, Ellen Burstyn as the elderly Murph, and legendary actor Michael Caine as Professor John Brand. Supporting performances from Mackenzie Foy, Casey Affleck, Timothy Chalamet, Wes Bentley, Topher Grace, David Gyasi, John Lithgow, Matt Damon, and several others add emotional depth and complexity to the story. Every major character plays a significant role in illustrating the film's central message that humanity's greatest strength lies not only in intelligence and technology but also in hope, compassion, and perseverance. Set in a dystopian future, Interstellar portrays an Earth that is slowly becoming uninhabitable. Decades of environmental decline have resulted in widespread crop failures, massive dust storms, and a mysterious agricultural blight that destroys nearly every food source. Humanity faces an unprecedented crisis as the planet's atmosphere gradually becomes incapable of sustaining life. Society has shifted away from scientific progress towards simple agricultural survival, with most people becoming farmers because producing food has become the world's highest priority. Advanced technological development has slowed dramatically, and even the achievements of the Apollo moon missions are dismissed as historical propaganda in schools. This bleak future creates an atmosphere of desperation and uncertainty, providing the emotional foundation for the film's narrative. Joseph Cooper, commonly referred to simply as Cooper, once dreamed of exploring the stars. A brilliant engineer and former NASA test pilot, he is now forced to spend his days farming in order to help feed the world's shrinking population. Cooper lives with his father-in-law Donald, his teenage son Tom, and his exceptionally intelligent daughter Murph. Although he has accepted his new life, Cooper still longs for the excitement and purpose he once found in aviation and space exploration. His relationship with Murph forms the emotional heart of the film. Their close bond is built on mutual curiosity, intelligence, and an unwavering belief in one another. Murph inherits her father's scientific mindset and refuses to accept simple explanations for mysterious events occurring in her bedroom, believing instead that some unknown force is trying to communicate with her. These strange gravitational anomalies eventually lead Cooper and Murph to a hidden underground NASA facility that has been operating in complete secrecy. There they meet Professor John Brand, who reveals that NASA has been quietly planning humanity's survival despite the world's political abandonment of space exploration. Professor Brand explains that a mysterious wormhole has appeared near Saturn, offering a gateway to another galaxy where several potentially habitable planets have already been identified through previous exploratory missions known as the Lazarus missions. Since Earth is dying, humanity's only realistic hope is to find a new world where civilization can begin again. Cooper is asked to pilot the spacecraft Endurance on a mission through the wormhole to evaluate these candidate planets and determine which offers the best chance for human survival. Leaving Earth is not an easy decision. Cooper knows that accepting the mission means leaving his children behind, perhaps forever. Murph feels deeply betrayed when her father chooses the mission over remaining with his family, believing he has abandoned her during humanity's darkest hour. Their painful farewell becomes one of the film's most emotionally powerful moments, emphasizing the enormous personal sacrifices required for the greater good. Cooper promises Murph that he will return, although neither of them truly understands how time itself will become their greatest enemy. The Endurance crew consists of Cooper, Dr. Amelia Brand, physicist Rumley, geographer Doyle, and highly advanced artificial intelligence robots TARS and Case. Unlike many cinematic portrayals of robots as cold or threatening machines, TARS and Case possess distinctive personalities, dry humor, remarkable intelligence, and unwavering loyalty. Their unconventional rectangular designs emphasize functionality rather than human resemblance, reflecting Christopher Nolan's preference for practical engineering over science fiction cliches. One of Interstellar's defining strengths is its remarkable commitment to scientific realism. The film's scientific concepts were heavily influenced by renowned theoretical physicist Kip Thorne, who served as executive producer and scientific consultant throughout production. Rather than inventing fictional scientific principles, Nolan and Thorne sought to base the film's major ideas, including wormholes, black holes, gravitational time dilation, and higher dimensional space, on real theoretical physics. Although some creative liberties were necessary for storytelling purposes, the film remains one of Hollywood's most scientifically grounded depictions of space travel. The crew's journey through the wormhole introduces audiences to one of the film's most visually spectacular sequences. Instead of depicting the wormhole as a flat portal, the filmmakers portrayed it as a three-dimensional spherical distortion of space, consistent with modern theoretical models. This attention to scientific accuracy extends throughout the film and contributes significantly to its immersive realism. The first planet visited by the Endurance crew, known as Miller's Planet, orbits extremely close to the supermassive black hole Gargantua. Due to the immense gravitational forces involved, time passes dramatically slower on the planet than elsewhere in the universe. Every hour spent on its surface equals approximately 7 years back on Earth. This extraordinary consequence of Einstein's theory of general relativity becomes one of the film's most emotionally devastating elements. After a disastrous mission involving massive tidal waves, Cooper and the surviving crew return to their spacecraft only to discover that 23 years have passed for Rumley, who remained in orbit. Cooper also receives decades' worth of video messages from his now-grown children, forcing him to confront the painful reality that while only a few hours have passed for him, an entire generation has aged on Earth. The exploration continues to another candidate world associated with Dr. Mann, a respected scientist whose data initially suggested the planet could sustain human life. However, the crew discovers that Mann falsified his reports because he feared dying alone. His desperate actions create one of the film's most intense sequences as his selfishness threatens the survival of the entire mission. Dr. Mann represents the darker side of human nature, illustrating how fear and isolation can corrupt even the most intelligent individuals. His character serves as a philosophical contrast to Cooper, whose decisions are consistently driven by sacrifice, responsibility, and hope. Eventually, Cooper and Amelia realize that reaching humanity's future requires an almost impossible sacrifice. Cooper detaches from the Endurance spacecraft and falls into Gargantua's event horizon, expecting certain death. Instead, he finds himself inside a mysterious higher-dimensional structure known as the Tesseract. Here, time is represented as a physical dimension that can be observed and influenced simultaneously. Cooper realizes that the mysterious ghost Muff believed existed in her childhood bedroom was actually himself communicating across time using gravity. Through carefully manipulating gravitational forces, he transmits the quantum data necessary for Muff to solve the equations that allow humanity to escape Earth's gravity and establish massive space habitats. This extraordinary climax blends scientific speculation with emotional storytelling. While the concept of the Tesseract extends beyond current scientific understanding, it builds upon theoretical discussions involving extra dimensions and gravitational phenomena. More importantly, it reinforces the film's central emotional theme that love transcends time and distance. Cooper's ability to communicate with Muff is ultimately driven not by technology alone but by the enduring bond between father and daughter. The production history of Interstellar is nearly as fascinating as the film itself. Development began in 2006 when producer Linda Obst collaborated with theoretical physicist Kip Thorne to create a science fiction story grounded in real scientific principles. Originally, the project was intended for acclaimed director Steven Spielberg, with Jonathan Nolan writing the screenplay. However, scheduling conflicts and changes within the producing studio prevented Spielberg from directing. Eventually, Christopher Nolan joined the project, bringing his distinctive storytelling style while retaining the scientific foundation established by Thorne and Obst. Nolan revised the screenplay extensively, adding stronger emotional themes centered on family, memory, and sacrifice while preserving the scientific authenticity that distinguished the original concept. For producer Linda Obst, Interstellar represented the culmination of decades of work developing intelligent science fiction films. Sadly, it became her final producing credit before her passing, making the film an especially meaningful achievement in her remarkable career. Christopher Nolan approached production with his trademark commitment to practical filmmaking techniques. Rather than relying exclusively on digital effects, he insisted on constructing large physical spacecraft interiors, full-scale cockpit sets, rotating environments, and highly detailed miniature models. This practical approach allowed actors to interact with realistic environments and enhanced the film's immersive quality. Nolan has long believed that practical effects create more convincing performances and more believable cinematic worlds, and Interstellar exemplifies this philosophy. Acclaimed cinematographer Hoyt van Hoytema collaborated with Nolan to create the film's distinctive visual style. Large portions of Interstellar were photographed using 35mm film alongside IMAX 70mm cameras, producing exceptionally detailed images with remarkable clarity and scale. The expansive IMAX format proved especially effective for portraying the vastness of outer space, towering alien landscapes, and the overwhelming size of Gargantua. Wide panoramic shots contrast beautifully with intimate close-ups, emphasizing both humanity's insignificance within the cosmos and the deeply personal emotions driving the characters. Principal photography began in late 2013 and spanned multiple international locations. Alberta, Canada, provided expansive farmland for Earth's agricultural landscapes, while Iceland's dramatic glacier and volcanic terrain represented several alien planets featured in the story. Additional filming occurred in Los Angeles, where elaborate interior sets and NASA facilities were constructed. Nolan's commitment to filming in real locations rather than relying entirely on computer-generated environments contributed significantly to the film's realistic visual atmosphere. Although Interstellar incorporates extensive visual effects, these effects were carefully integrated with practical photography. The visual effects company DNEG created many of the film's digital sequences, including the scientifically accurate visualization of Gargantua, the Wormhole, and various space environments. Working closely with Kip Thorne, DNEG developed rendering techniques based directly on complex astrophysical equations. Their groundbreaking work produced imagery so scientifically accurate that it reportedly contributed to published scientific research regarding black hole visualization. Gargantua's glowing accretion disk, gravitational lensing, and distorted light patterns became iconic examples of science and cinema successfully influencing one another. The film's sound design and musical score further elevate its emotional impact. Composer Hans Zimmer created one of his most celebrated soundtracks by focusing less on traditional science fiction orchestration and more on themes of family, longing, and spiritual wonder. Using powerful pipe organs, minimalist motifs, and gradually expanding orchestral arrangements, Zimmer crafted music that enhances both the intimate emotional scenes and the film's awe-inspiring cosmic sequences. Rather than emphasizing danger or action, the score reflects hope, exploration, and humanity's enduring curiosity about the universe. Interstellar premiered at the TCL Chinese Theatre in Hollywood on October 26, 2014, before receiving its wide theatrical release in the United States on November 5, 2014. Paramount Pictures distributed the film domestically, while Warner Bros. Pictures handled international distribution. In keeping with Christopher Nolan's strong preference for traditional filmmaking formats, the film initially debuted on physical film stock in many theaters before expanding to digital projection venues worldwide. This release strategy highlighted Nolan's continuing advocacy for large-format cinematic experiences, particularly IMAX presentations. Commercially, Interstellar proved to be a major success. During its original theatrical release, the film earned approximately $681 million worldwide against a production budget estimated at around $165 million. Continued re-releases, including special IMAX anniversary screenings, significantly increased its total worldwide box office revenue to approximately $774.7 million. These impressive earnings made Interstellar the 10th highest-grossing film of 2014 and one of Christopher Nolan's most financially successful projects. More importantly, its popularity continued to grow long after its initial release, with many viewers discovering or revisiting the film through streaming platforms, home video releases, and theatrical reissues. Critical reception was generally positive, although opinions varied regarding the film's ambitious storytelling. Many critics praised Christopher Nolan's visionary direction, Matthew McConaughey's deeply emotional performance, Hans Zimmer's unforgettable musical score, Hoyt van Hoytema's stunning cinematography, and the film's willingness to tackle complex scientific ideas rarely explored in mainstream cinema. Reviewers also admired the emotional relationship between Cooper and Murph, considering it the film's strongest narrative element. Some critics, however, believed portions of the story became overly complex or philosophically ambitious. Despite these differing opinions, Interstellar gradually earned recognition as a modern science fiction classic, with its reputation strengthening considerably in the years following its release. Audiences embraced the film even more enthusiastically than many early reviews suggested. Its combination of spectacular visuals, emotional storytelling, scientific authenticity, and philosophical depth inspired countless discussions about black holes, time dilation, artificial intelligence, and humanity's future in space. Universities, scientists, educators, and filmmakers frequently reference Interstellar when discussing how cinema can successfully communicate advanced scientific concepts to general audiences. During award season, Interstellar received numerous nominations across multiple ceremonies. At the 87th Academy Awards, the film earned 5 Oscar nominations, including recognition for Best Original Score, Best Sound Mixing, Best Sound Editing, Best Production Design, and Best Visual Effects. It ultimately won the Academy Award for Best Visual Effects, recognizing the extraordinary achievement of DNEG and the visual effects team in creating scientifically authentic yet visually breathtaking representations of space phenomena. The film also received honors from organizations celebrating cinematography, music, technical achievement, and science communication. Today, Interstellar remains one of Christopher Nolan's defining works and one of the most influential science fiction films ever produced. It demonstrates that blockbuster cinema can successfully combine emotional storytelling, philosophical exploration, scientific rigor, and technical innovation without sacrificing entertainment value. More than a decade after its release, the film continues to inspire new audiences, spark conversations about humanity's future among the stars, and encourage curiosity about the mysteries of the universe. Its lasting legacy lies not only in its groundbreaking visual achievements but also in its deeply human message, that even in the face of extinction, uncertainty, and the unimaginable vastness of space, hope, love, and the desire to explore will always define what it means to be human. The story of Interstellar unfolds in a future where humanity is facing its greatest crisis. Earth, once a thriving planet filled with forests, oceans, and abundant life, has become increasingly hostile to human existence. A mysterious blight is destroying crops across the globe, while massive dust storms blanket entire regions, making agriculture almost impossible. Food shortages have become common, economies have collapsed, and governments have shifted their priorities away from technological innovation toward basic survival. Scientific exploration is no longer considered important because humanity is struggling simply to stay alive. Former engineers, scientists, and pilots have abandoned their professions to become farmers, desperately trying to grow enough food for the world's shrinking population. Among these people is Joseph Cooper, a highly skilled engineer and former NASA pilot who now lives on a farm with his father-in-law Donald, his teenage son Tom, and his exceptionally intelligent daughter Murphy, affectionately known as Muff. Books mysteriously fall from her bookshelf, and unusual patterns appear in the dust covering her floor. Cooper initially dismisses these incidents as natural phenomena, but after carefully studying the dust patterns, he realizes they form a binary code containing precise geographical coordinates. Curious about the mysterious message, Cooper decides to investigate. He and Muff follow the coordinates to a hidden underground facility, where they discover that NASA has secretly continued operating despite the world's governments officially abandoning space exploration years earlier. There they meet Professor John Brand, one of the greatest scientists of his generation, along with his daughter Dr. Amelia Brand, physicist David Rummerly, and geographer Doyle. Professor Brand reveals a truth that few people know: Earth is dying much faster than the public realizes. The atmospheric blight is steadily consuming oxygen, and within a few generations, humanity will become extinct if a new home cannot be found. Brand explains that several decades earlier, a mysterious wormhole suddenly appeared near Saturn. Unlike fictional portals often seen in science fiction, this wormhole offers a genuine shortcut through space-time, allowing travel to another galaxy millions of light-years away. Beyond the wormhole lies a distant star system orbiting a supermassive black hole called Gargantua. NASA previously sent 12 astronauts through the wormhole on exploratory missions known as the Lazarus missions. Their task was to search for habitable planets capable of supporting human life. After years of exploration, only 3 astronauts, Dr. Laura Miller, Dr. Mann, and Dr. Edmonds, continued transmitting positive data, suggesting their planets might be suitable for colonization. Professor Brand presents Cooper with humanity's final hope. A spacecraft named Endurance is ready to travel through the wormhole and evaluate the 3 promising planets. Cooper's exceptional experience as both an engineer and pilot makes him uniquely qualified to command the mission. Accepting the offer means leaving his children behind with no guarantee of ever returning. Cooper struggles with the decision because he deeply loves Muff and Tom, but he also understands that refusing the mission could doom future generations. Ultimately, he chooses to join the expedition, believing that his sacrifice may secure humanity's survival. Muff is devastated by her father's decision. Feeling abandoned, she refuses to say goodbye properly and angrily accuses Cooper of choosing space over his family. Cooper promises her that he will return someday, although neither of them knows how long that journey will actually take. Their heartbreaking farewell becomes one of the film's most emotional moments, establishing the father-daughter relationship that drives the entire story. The Endurance crew consists of Cooper, Amelia Brand, Rumley, Doyle, and two advanced artificial intelligence robots named Tars and Case. Unlike many science fiction robots, Tars and Case are practical, highly intelligent machines with distinctive personalities and a subtle sense of humor. Their reliability and problem-solving abilities make them invaluable members of the mission. After launching into space, the crew travels to Saturn, where they encounter the enormous wormhole floating silently in orbit. Passing through it is unlike anything they have ever experienced. Space and time appear to bend around them as they emerge into a completely different galaxy centered around Gargantua, one of the largest and most powerful black holes ever discovered. The immense gravitational forces surrounding Gargantua create extraordinary physical effects that will profoundly influence the crew's mission. Their first destination is Miller's Planet, chosen because its previous explorer transmitted encouraging data before communication suddenly stopped. The planet appears deceptively peaceful from orbit, consisting almost entirely of shallow water stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Rumley remains aboard the Endurance to conduct scientific research while Cooper, Amelia, Doyle, and Tars descend to the surface. Upon landing, they discover the ocean world is unlike anything they expected. Towering mountains in the distance gradually reveal themselves to be gigantic tidal waves hundreds of feet high. Because Miller's Planet orbits extremely close to Gargantua, the black hole's gravitational pull creates immense tsunamis that constantly sweep across the planet. Before the crew can safely evacuate, one enormous wave crashes into them. Doyle is swept away and killed almost instantly, while their spacecraft suffers severe damage. Cooper and Amelia narrowly escape with Tars and struggle back into orbit. The disaster has consequences far greater than losing one crew member. Due to Einstein's theory of gravitational time dilation, time flows much slower on Miller's Planet than elsewhere. Every single hour spent on the planet equals approximately 7 years on Earth. By the time Cooper and Amelia return to the Endurance, more than 23 Earth years have passed. Rumley, who remained aboard the spacecraft waiting for their return, has aged dramatically during his years of isolation. Cooper receives decades of recorded video messages from Earth and is overwhelmed to discover that his children have become adults while only a few hours have passed for him. He watches Tom marry, become a father, and later lose his own child. Muff, still deeply hurt by Cooper's departure, refuses to send messages for many years. This sequence powerfully illustrates one of the film's central themes, the heartbreaking cost of space exploration when time itself becomes an enemy. Back on Earth, Muff has grown into a brilliant scientist working alongside Professor Brand at NASA. She dedicates her life to solving the complex gravitational equation that could allow enormous space stations carrying humanity to escape Earth's gravity. For years she believes Professor Brand is genuinely working towards saving everyone on Earth. However, as Brand nears the end of his life, he finally confesses a devastating truth. The gravitational equation has always lacked crucial quantum data that cannot be obtained without entering a black hole. He secretly knew the equation could never be completed before Cooper departed. The Endurance mission's true purpose was not to rescue Earth's current population but to transport frozen human embryos to another world where civilization could begin again. Muff is furious. She realizes her father unknowingly participated in a mission built upon false hope. Feeling betrayed by both Professor Brand and Cooper, she believes everyone remaining on Earth has been abandoned. Before Brand dies, Muff vows to continue searching for the missing solution herself. Meanwhile, aboard the Endurance, the crew debates their next destination. Amelia argues passionately for visiting Edmund's planet, partly because she shared a romantic relationship with Dr. Edmonds before the mission. Cooper instead favors Dr. Mann's planet because its data appears more promising. They ultimately choose Mann's planet, believing it offers the highest probability of supporting life. Initially, Dr. Mann appears to be exactly the heroic scientist everyone expected. Rescued from years of isolation, he explains the harsh conditions of his frozen world. However, Cooper gradually discovers disturbing inconsistencies in Mann's scientific reports. Eventually, Mann confesses that he deliberately falsified the planet's data. His world is completely uninhabitable, but overwhelming loneliness and despair drove him to send false signals so someone would come rescue him. Mann's betrayal transforms him into one of the story's primary antagonists. Desperate to survive, he attempts to murder Cooper by abandoning him beneath the icy surface. Cooper barely escapes death, while Man races back toward the Endurance intending to steal the spacecraft and leave everyone else behind. Before Cooper can stop him, Rumley investigates an automated research station left by Man. Hidden explosives destroy the station, instantly killing Rumley. His death further reduces the already struggling crew. Man reaches the Endurance first and attempts to dock his shuttle without following proper procedures. Ignoring Cooper's repeated warnings, he tries forcing the damaged spacecraft into position. The docking operation fails catastrophically, causing explosive decompression that kills Man instantly. The Endurance begins spinning uncontrollably toward destruction. In one of the film's most thrilling sequences, Cooper manually pilots his shuttle and performs an almost impossible high-speed rotational docking maneuver, successfully stabilizing the damaged spacecraft moments before it is consumed by Gargantua's gravity. Although Cooper regains control, the Endurance has suffered severe damage and lacks enough fuel to return to Earth. The remaining crew members realize only one destination remains possible: Edmund's planet. However, reaching it requires an enormous gravitational slingshot around Gargantua. To reduce weight and give Amelia enough momentum, Cooper makes an extraordinary decision. He detaches his own spacecraft from the Endurance, sacrificing himself so Amelia can continue humanity's mission. TARS voluntarily accompanies Cooper because obtaining quantum data from inside the black hole may still help solve the gravitational equation on Earth. As Cooper and TARS plunge into Gargantua, they expect to be crushed by unimaginable gravitational forces. Instead, Cooper awakens inside an astonishing higher-dimensional structure called a tesseract. Here, time no longer exists as a simple sequence of past, present, and future. Every moment inside Muff's childhood bedroom exists simultaneously, arranged across countless dimensions. Cooper realizes the mysterious ghost Muff believed haunted her room was actually himself communicating backward through time. Using gravity, the only force capable of crossing dimensions, Cooper manipulates books, watches, and dust particles to send messages to his younger self and to Muff. He understands that the binary coordinates leading him to NASA were created by his future self all along. Most importantly, TARS successfully records the quantum information collected inside Gargantua. Cooper encodes this data into the second hand of Muff's wristwatch using Morse code. Years earlier, he had given Muff the watch before leaving Earth, asking her to keep it until he returned. Meanwhile, the adult Muff continues investigating the mysterious gravitational anomalies she experienced as a child. She finally realizes her father has been communicating with her across time. Carefully decoding the watch's movements, she extracts the quantum data transmitted by Cooper. With this final missing information, she successfully completes Professor Brand's impossible gravitational equation. Humanity can now construct enormous space stations capable of escaping Earth's gravity and preserving civilization beyond the dying planet. Cooper and TARS conclude that neither the wormhole nor the tesseract occurred naturally. Both were created by immensely advanced future humans who evolved beyond ordinary space and time. These beings did not directly save humanity but instead created the conditions allowing humanity to save itself. Their actions form a self-contained time loop in which Cooper becomes both the cause and the consequence of the mission's success. After transmitting the necessary information, the tesseract begins collapsing. Cooper is suddenly ejected from the higher dimensional environment and expelled from the wormhole back into familiar space near Saturn. He and TARS are rescued by spacecraft belonging to humanity's newly established space colonies. When Cooper awakens, he discovers that decades have passed on Earth. Humanity now lives aboard enormous rotating space stations that recreate Earth's natural environment, complete with farms, houses, schools, and blue skies. One of these habitats has been named Cooper Station in honor of Muff's achievements rather than Cooper's own heroics. Cooper is reunited with Muff, but the reunion is bittersweet. Because of the extreme effects of time dilation near Gargantua, Muff has become an elderly woman while Cooper remains relatively young. Surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, Muff tells Cooper that no parent should have to watch their child die. She explains that she always knew he would keep his promise to return, even if it happened much later than either of them imagined. Having ensured humanity's survival, Muff is nearing the end of her life. She encourages Cooper not to remain with her but instead to seek out Amelia Brand, who is now alone on Edmund's planet. Inspired by Muff's final wish, Cooper steals a small spacecraft along with TARS and sets out once more into deep space. Their destination is Edmund's planet, where Amelia has successfully landed. Having discovered that the planet possesses a breathable atmosphere and conditions capable of supporting human life, Amelia begins constructing humanity's first permanent extraterrestrial colony with the assistance of Case and automated robotic equipment. In the film's closing moments, Amelia visits the grave of Dr. Edmonds, who apparently died before she arrived. She removes her helmet and breathes the surrounding air, confirming that the atmosphere is safe for humans. Looking across the beautiful alien landscape, she begins preparing the foundations of a new civilization. While Cooper travels across the stars to reunite with her, humanity finally possesses a future beyond the dying Earth. The ending leaves audiences with a profound message of hope. Despite overwhelming obstacles, impossible distances, and the relentless passage of time, human courage, scientific discovery, and the enduring power of love can secure a future among the stars. When Christopher Nolan set out to make Interstellar, he faced a peculiar creative problem that has confounded science fiction filmmakers for decades. How do you render the impossible, interstellar travel, wormholes, black holes, time dilation, without it feeling like fantasy? The answer, as it turns out, had less to do with dazzling audiences with alien vistas than with grounding every technological element in something recognizably human, worn, and mechanical. Across production design, sound engineering, and musical composition, Interstellar pursued a singular philosophy: the future should feel used, not imagined, the silence of space should feel oppressive, not empty, and the emotional core of the story, a father's separation from his daughter, should drive even the most abstract technical decisions. What emerges from examining these three pillars of the film's craft is a portrait of a production team refusing to let spectacle overwhelm intimacy. The endurance and the aesthetics of plausibility. At the center of Interstellar's visual world sits the Endurance, the spacecraft that carries Cooper and his crew toward a wormhole near Saturn and, eventually, toward the promise of a habitable world for humanity. Production designer Nathan Crowley made a decision early on that would define the entire visual language of the film. Rather than inventing a sleek, futuristic vessel unmoored from any real-world precedent, he grounded the Endurance's design directly in the International Space Station. This choice reflects a broader design philosophy that runs through nearly all of Nolan's collaborations with Crowley, a commitment to practical, tactile realism even when depicting events far beyond current human capability. The Endurance takes the form of a ring, a wheel-like assembly of 12 modular capsules arranged like the numbers on a clock face. This is not merely an aesthetic flourish, it is a functional design that alludes to centrifugal artificial gravity, a concept spacecraft engineers have proposed for decades as a way to counteract the physiological toll of prolonged weightlessness. The 12 capsules are divided by purpose: for house the settling equipment needed to establish habitats on newly discovered planets, for house the engines that propel and maneuver the craft, and for serve as the permanent home for the crew, cockpit, medical bay, and living quarters. This tripartite division does more than organize the ship's interior logically, it reflects the mission's actual purpose. The Endurance is not simply a vehicle for travel, it is an ark, a vessel meant to carry the seeds of human civilization to a new world. Its architecture encodes that responsibility, allocating equal weight to propulsion, survival, and colonization. Crowley's now famous description of the ship as a real mishmash of different kinds of technology gets at something crucial about how Interstellar imagines its future. Rather than presenting a monolithic, homogeneous vision of advanced technology, the film insists on layering old and new, analog and digital, redundant and cutting-edge. Crowley's insistence that you need analog stuff, as well as digital stuff, you need backup systems and tangible switches, reveals an underlying anxiety about the fragility of purely digital systems in the vacuum of space, millions of miles from any repair facility. A ship traveling to another galaxy cannot afford single points of failure. It needs the redundancy of physical switches that can be flipped even if a screen goes dark, levers that can be pulled even if software crashes. This is why Crowley likened the Endurance to a submarine in space, an apt comparison, since submarines represent perhaps the closest terrestrial analog to the kind of self-contained, life-or-death engineering environment that interstellar travel would demand. Submarines, like the Endurance, must function as sealed ecosystems, places where every mechanism has been tested against catastrophic failure, where crews depend on both sophisticated instrumentation and blunt, foolproof manual overrides. This philosophy, every inch of space is used, everything has a purpose, also reflects a deeper truth about how spacecraft design in reality must contend with the brutal economics of mass and volume. Every kilogram launched into space costs enormous amounts of fuel and money, every cubic meter of habitable volume must be wrung for maximum utility. By grounding the Endurance's interior in these real engineering constraints, Crowley and Nolan created an environment that feels less like a movie set built to please the eye and more like a machine built to keep human beings alive across years of travel through hostile environments. The Ranger and the Lander, utility as character. If the Endurance represents the film's flagship vision of a mothership, the Ranger and Lander crafts represent something more specialized and, in some ways, more emotionally resonant because of their direct connection to actual historical spacecraft. The Ranger, designed to enter and exit planetary atmospheres in the manner of NASA's Space Shuttle, borrows visual and functional DNA from a vehicle audiences already recognize, whether consciously or not. This deliberate echo serves an important narrative function. It tells viewers, without any exposition, that this technology descends from a lineage they already trust and understand. The Ranger doesn't need to explain itself because its silhouette does the explaining. Here is a craft built to shuttle between the vacuum of space and the turbulence of an atmosphere, exactly as shuttles have done for decades. The lander, meanwhile, occupies a different niche entirely. Its purpose is blunt and industrial, to ferry the heavy settling equipment capsules down to a planet's surface so that human colonists might establish a foothold. Crowley's comparison of the lander to a heavy Russian helicopter is telling, both for its specificity and for what it implies about the aesthetic register the filmmakers were reaching for. Russian and Soviet-era heavy-lift helicopters, machines like the Mi-26, are renowned not for elegance but for sheer brute functionality, overbuilt, utilitarian, capable of hauling enormous loads under punishing conditions. By invoking this image, Crowley signals that the lander is not meant to look beautiful or futuristic in the way popular imagination often demands of spacecraft. It is meant to look like a tool, a workhorse, something an engineer would design purely to accomplish a task rather than to inspire awe. This commitment to utilitarian ugliness, so to speak, reinforces the film's broader ethos. This is what spacefaring technology would actually look like if humanity built it under resource constraints and existential urgency, not for spectacle. Taken together, the Endurance, the Ranger, and the lander form a coherent ecosystem of vehicles, each purpose-built for a specific phase of the mission, each bearing visual cues that root them in recognizable engineering traditions: the space station, the shuttle, the heavy-lift helicopter. This is production design functioning almost like world-building through citation, allowing the audience's existing knowledge of real spacecraft to fill in gaps of plausibility that dialogue alone could never achieve. TARS and CASE, geometry as emotional language. Perhaps the most distinctive and widely discussed design achievement in Interstellar is its treatment of robotic characters. Science fiction cinema has a long, well-worn tradition of anthropomorphic robots, droids with humanoid proportions, expressive faces, eyes that convey emotion, voices calibrated to sound endearing or menacing. Nolan made the unusual decision to reject this tradition entirely. TARS and CASE, the two functioning robots in the film, alongside the dismantled third unit, KIP, possess no face, no limbs in any conventional sense, no anthropomorphic silhouette whatsoever. Instead, they take the form of tall rectangular blocks, roughly 1.5 meters in height, that move and reconfigure themselves through a system of hinged, subdividing segments. Nolan's explanation of the design logic behind these robots reveals a fascinating creative process rooted almost entirely in mathematics rather than in traditional character design. The robots consist of 4 main blocks capable of joining in 3 distinct configurational modes. Within each of those combinations, further subdivision occurs, 3 joints nested within the larger structure, and within those, additional subdivisions still. Nolan described this as a system where, in principle, you can unfold a finger, meaning the recursive logic of the design allows for increasingly fine articulation, all derived from the same basic geometric principle repeated at smaller and smaller scales. This is, in essence, a fractal approach to robotic design, a single mathematical rule, applied recursively, generating the appearance of complex movement and dexterity from remarkably simple constituent parts. The result is a robot whose physicality communicates competence and reliability without ever risking the uncanny valley effect that plagues so many attempts at human-like robotic faces. TARS in particular becomes a beloved character not through facial expression but through voice, timing, wit, and the sheer effectiveness of its blocky, utilitarian movements, rolling, folding, striding in ways that feel alien yet perfectly logical once you understand the underlying geometric rules. This design choice pays enormous dividends in the film's emotional register. Because TARS has no face, audiences are never distracted by the question of whether its expressions are convincing. Instead, all of the character's warmth is carried entirely through vocal performance and behavior, which paradoxically makes the character feel more intelligent and more trustworthy, since its personality is not filtered through the imprecise mimicry of human facial muscles. The production's approach to actually creating these robots on set adds another layer of ingenuity. Bill Irwin, an actor and movement specialist known for his physical theater background, both voiced and physically controlled the robots during filming, operating them like elaborate puppets so that the actors on set could react to something tangible rather than a tennis ball on a stick or a purely digital effect added later. Irwin's physical performance was then digitally removed from the final footage, leaving behind only the robots' movements as though they were autonomous. This technique, performing the robot practically, then erasing the performer, reflects the same analog first, digital as refinement philosophy that governed the Endurance's design. Just as Crowley wanted tangible switches the actors could actually flip, Nolan wanted his cast reacting to something real, a physical presence with weight and momentum, rather than pretending to interact with an empty space that visual effects artists would later populate. The O'Neill cylinder and the vision of humanity's future home. Beyond the vehicles that carry the story's characters across the cosmos, Interstellar also imagines what a permanent human future in space might look like, and here again the filmmakers turn to real scientific history rather than pure invention. The human space habitats glimpsed toward the film's conclusion are visually and conceptually modeled on O'Neill cylinders, a theoretical design first proposed by physicist Gerard K. O'Neill in the 1970s. O'Neill's concept envisioned enormous rotating cylindrical structures, potentially miles in length, that would use centrifugal force to simulate gravity along their inner surface, upon which entire landscapes, waterways, and communities could exist. Sunlight would be admitted through long windows or mirrors positioned along the cylinder's length, and the rotating motion would create an artificial up and down oriented outward from the central axis. By anchoring the film's vision of humanity's ultimate destiny in a real, decades-old scientific proposal, Interstellar once again reinforces its commitment to plausibility over pure invention. O'Neill's cylinders were never simply science fiction set dressing. They emerged from serious engineering analysis conducted at Princeton and were seriously discussed within NASA-adjacent circles during the 1970s as a genuine option for long-term space settlement. Incorporating this concept into the film's final vision of humanity's salvation lends the ending a sense of scientific legitimacy that a wholly invented structure could never achieve. It suggests that the world the characters are fighting to reach was never fantastical to begin with, that it was, in fact, an idea humanity had already conceived, sitting dormant in academic journals, waiting only for the technological and social will to build it. Sound design as emotional architecture. If the visual design of Interstellar aimed for tactile plausibility, its sound design pursued an equally rigorous, if less visible, philosophy, sound as an instrument of immersion and emotional manipulation, wielded with precision. Sound designer Richard King supervised the process, working alongside audio engineers Greg Landacre and Gary A. Rizzo to construct a mix that Nolan insisted should exploit theatrical sound systems to their fullest capability. This was not sound design in service of realism alone but sound design in service of physical sensation. Nolan wanted audiences to feel the film in their chests, not merely hear it through their ears. One of the more revealing anecdotes about this process involves the seemingly minor detail of astronaut glove buttons. Nolan reportedly paid extraordinarily close attention to how the act of pressing buttons while wearing thick spacesuit gloves should sound, a level of granular attention that speaks to his broader belief that verisimilitude lives in accumulated small details rather than sweeping gestures. A viewer may never consciously register the specific timbre of a glove pressing a switch, but the cumulative effect of thousands of such carefully considered details is a sensory environment that feels lived in and physically real, rather than assembled from generic sound effect libraries. The studio's own description of the film's audio mix emphasized its calibration to maximize the power of the low-end frequencies in the main channels, as well as in the subwoofer channel. This emphasis on low-end frequency is significant because bass frequencies are felt as much as heard. They resonate physically in a viewer's chest and seat, creating a visceral, almost tactile sense of scale and power. For a film obsessed with the crushing gravitational forces of black holes, the deafening roar of rocket engines, and the abyssal vastness of space, this bass-heavy approach to sound mixing becomes a direct sonic analog to the film's thematic content. The audience is meant to feel the same overwhelming physical forces the characters are experiencing, not simply observe them from a comfortable narrative distance. The deliberate drowning of dialogue. No aspect of Interstellar's sound design generated more public discussion, and indeed controversy, than Nolan's decision to intentionally obscure certain lines of dialogue beneath layers of ambient noise and Hans Zimmer's thunderous score. This was not an oversight or a mixing error, though many audiences and even theater staff initially assumed it was exactly that. The effect was significant enough that some theaters felt compelled to post signage explicitly reassuring patrons that the muffled dialogue was an intentional artistic choice rather than a malfunction in the projection or sound equipment. This choice reflects a broader aesthetic philosophy that runs throughout Nolan's filmography, a willingness to prioritize sensory and emotional experience over strict narrative clarity. By allowing dialogue to be partially swallowed by the roar of engines or the swell of Zimmer's organ-driven score, Nolan effectively communicates something that clean, fully audible dialogue could not: the overwhelming, disorienting nature of existing within these extreme environments, where human voices become fragile and small against the churning of machinery and the indifferent vastness of the cosmos. It is a formal choice that mirrors the content of the film itself. Humanity's voice, its language, its very ability to communicate and be understood, is placed in constant tension with forces, gravitational, temporal, cosmic, that dwarf it entirely. The muffling of dialogue becomes, in this reading, not a failure of the sound mix but a sonic embodiment of humanity's precarious, diminished position within the universe the film depicts. Hans Zimmer and the organ of Temple Church. The emotional backbone of Interstellar, however, is ultimately carried not by its production design or its sound effects but by Hans Zimmer's score, which represents one of the most unusual and revealing creative collaborations in the film's development. Zimmer, who had already scored Nolan's The Dark Knight trilogy and Inception, was brought back for Interstellar, but Nolan's approach to briefing him was strikingly unconventional. Rather than handing Zimmer a script or explaining the film's elaborate plot involving wormholes, black holes, and interdimensional communication, Nolan gave the composer a single page containing nothing more than the simple, universal story of a father leaving his child behind to go to work. This decision reveals an enormous amount about how Nolan understood the emotional core of his own film. Stripped of its science fiction trappings, the astrophysics, the multiple planets, the theoretical physics of relativity and time dilation, Interstellar is fundamentally a story about parental separation and the passage of time as experienced by a parent and child living through radically different timelines. By giving Zimmer only this emotional kernel, uncontaminated by plot mechanics or genre expectations, Nolan ensured that the score would be built from pure feeling rather than from an attempt to musically illustrate spaceships or wormholes. The result is a score whose emotional urgency feels less like an accompaniment to the science fiction elements and more like their true subject, threading through every scene regardless of whether it depicts a cornfield in Kansas or the crushing gravitational field of a black hole. The specific instrumental choice that came to define the score, the 1926 four-manual Harrison and Harrison organ housed in London's Temple Church, was arrived at collaboratively between Zimmer and Nolan. The organ is a particularly resonant choice for a film about space, time, and the limits of human understanding, given the instrument's historical association with vast cathedral spaces, religious contemplation, and the sublime. An organ's pipes fill an entire architectural space with sound in a way few other instruments can replicate, and this quality of enveloping, almost overwhelming sonic presence mirrors the film's visual obsession with scale, the way it dwarfs its human characters against wormholes, ice planets, and the churning accretion disk of the black hole Gargantua. The organ's historically religious connotations also subtly reinforce the film's persistent, if understated, engagement with questions of faith, transcendence, and forces beyond human comprehension, even as the story insists on a scientifically grounded universe. The sheer scale of Zimmer's effort on this score further underscores its centrality to the film's identity. Zimmer conducted 45 separate scoring sessions for Interstellar, a figure 3 times greater than the number of sessions required for Inception. This intensity of production reflects the score's structural importance to the finished film. The music is not merely layered atop the action but functions as connective tissue binding together the film's disparate settings and timescales, giving emotional continuity to a narrative that otherwise leaps across galaxies, decades, and dimensions. Conclusion: craft in service of feeling. What unites the production design, sound engineering, and musical score of Interstellar is a consistent, almost obsessive commitment to grounding cosmic-scale spectacle in tangible, human-centered detail. Nathan Crowley's spacecraft borrow their DNA from real engineering precedents, the International Space Station, the Space Shuttle, heavy-lift helicopters, because plausibility, not novelty, generates trust. TARS and CASE reject anthropomorphism in favor of mathematical elegance, proving that emotional resonance in a robotic character need not depend on a human face. The O'Neill cylinder habitats root the film's hopeful ending in decades-old scientific proposal rather than pure fantasy. Richard King's sound design attends to the smallest tactile details, glove buttons and bass frequencies alike, while Nolan's deliberate obscuring of dialogue turns an unconventional mixing choice into a formal expression of humanity's smallness against the universe. And Hans Zimmer's score, built not from plot summary but from the single emotional truth of a parent leaving a child, finds its voice in an instrument historically associated with awe and transcendence. While much has been written about Christopher Nolan's meticulous approach to the craft of Interstellar, its production design, its sound engineering, its Zimmer-composed score, the film's commercial trajectory tells its own story, one that reveals as much about the changing landscape of global cinema exhibition in the mid-2010s as it does about the film itself. Interstellar arrived in theaters in November 2014 as a mid-budget prestige blockbuster, a designation that sounds almost contradictory but accurately describes a film that commanded a substantial production budget, an A-list cast, and a director with a proven track record, while still pursuing an original, non-franchise story rooted in hard science rather than pre-existing intellectual property. Its performance at the box office, in IMAX theaters specifically, and eventually in the home entertainment market, offers a revealing case study in how a film without sequels, superheroes, or established source material could still command enormous global attention. A budget-to-gross ratio worth examining. Interstellar was produced on a budget of $165 million, a substantial sum that reflected the scale of its ambitions, extensive practical effects work, elaborate set construction, location shooting, and a visual effects program dedicated to rendering scientifically grounded depictions of a wormhole and a black hole. Against that investment, the film ultimately generated $681 million in worldwide theatrical revenue, split between $188 million earned domestically across the United States and Canada and a considerably larger $493 million collected from international markets. This domestic-to-international ratio is itself worth pausing on, since it reveals something important about how the film was received differently depending on geography. Roughly 70% of the film's total theatrical gross came from outside North America, a pattern that has become increasingly common for large-scale studio productions, but that still marks Interstellar as a film whose commercial success depended heavily on international audiences embracing a story that, on paper, centers on very American anxieties, a dust-choked Midwestern farm, a NASA remnant operating in secret, and a father torn between duty to his country and to his daughter. Despite this considerable revenue, the film's actual profitability was far more modest than its headline gross might suggest. Deadline Hollywood, a trade publication known for calculating a film's true profitability by accounting for the full scope of costs beyond the production budget alone, marketing expenditures, talent profit participations, distribution fees, and other overhead, estimated that Interstellar generated a net profit of approximately $47 million. That figure, while respectable, is a fraction of the $681 million headline number, and it placed the film 20th on Deadline's ranking of the year's most valuable blockbusters. This gap between gross revenue and net profit is instructive for anyone trying to understand how studio economics actually function. A film can dominate global box office charts and still deliver a comparatively narrow return once the full weight of a modern blockbuster's marketing campaign, participation deals with its stars and director, and other invisible costs are subtracted. In ticket terms, the film's domestic performance translated into an estimated 22 million admissions in the United States and Canada alone, a substantial audience by any measure, even if the resulting revenue, once divided among exhibitors, distributors, and the studio, left a comparatively thin margin of pure profit. Dominating the IMAX format. If there is one exhibition format where Interstellar's performance was unambiguously historic, it was IMAX. Nolan has long been one of the format's most vocal champions among major directors, frequently shooting significant portions of his films with IMAX cameras to maximize the visual and immersive potential of the giant screen format, and Interstellar continued that tradition. The results were reflected directly in the numbers. The film opened worldwide with $20.5 million in IMAX revenue drawn from 574 IMAX theaters, a result that broke the previous worldwide IMAX opening record of $17 million, which had been held by The Hunger Games, Catching Fire the year before. This made Interstellar launch the best opening ever recorded for an IMAX release in the 2D format, the best for a non-sequel film in IMAX, and the best for any IMAX release specifically debuting in the month of November. Over the course of its run, the film went on to become only the fourth motion picture in history to surpass $100 million in worldwide ticket sales specifically through IMAX screens, joining an elite tier of films that had managed to convert the format's premium pricing and limited screen count into truly massive aggregate revenue. These IMAX figures matter beyond mere record-keeping because they illuminate something essential about how Interstellar was marketed and consumed, as an experience rather than simply as a narrative. Nolan's insistence, discussed extensively in relation to the film's sound design, on maximizing the physical, sensory impact of the theatrical experience found a natural ally in the IMAX format, whose larger screens and superior sound systems were built precisely to deliver the kind of immersive, bass-heavy, visually overwhelming experience the director wanted audiences to feel in their chests as much as process with their eyes. Audiences responded to that pitch by seeking out IMAX presentations disproportionately relative to standard screenings, a trend reflected in the fact that IMAX screens, despite representing a small fraction of the total theater count showing the film, contributed a wildly outsized share of early revenue. Opening weekend, a battle with Big Hero 6. Interstellar's domestic release did not occur in a commercial vacuum. It opened during the same November 2014 weekend as Walt Disney Animation Studios' Big Hero 6, and prior to release, both films were projected by industry analysts to perform similarly, with expectations for each landing somewhere between $55 million and $60 million for their opening weekends. Before its wide release, however, Interstellar received an unusual early rollout, a limited release beginning on the evening of November 4, deliberately timed to coincide with the 2014 United States midterm elections, playing in 249 selected theaters starting at 8 p.m. Of those theaters, 42 were IMAX screens, and IMAX presentations accounted for a remarkable 62% of the film's total gross during this early limited release phase. Notably, 240 of these early theaters presented the film using traditional film formats rather than purely digital projection, 35mm, 70mm, and IMAX 70mm, reflecting Nolan's well-documented preference for photochemical film over digital cinematography and projection wherever exhibition infrastructure allowed it. This early limited release, combined with additional late-night preview screenings, generated a preview total of $4.9 million before the film's official wide release, with late-night shows alone contributing $3.6 million of that sum. When the film opened widely on November 7, it topped the daily box office chart on its first day, earning $17 million compared to $15.8 million for Big Hero 6. Over the full three-day opening weekend, however, the fortunes of the two films essentially inverted. Interstellar earned $47.5 million, narrowly finishing behind Big Hero 6's $56.2 million in a tightly contested race for the top position, ultimately debuting at number 2 rather than number 1. IMAX screenings alone contributed $13.2 million, or roughly 28%, of that opening weekend total, while other premium large-format screens, alternative giant screen systems used by competing exhibition chains, added a further $5.3 million, representing about 10.5% of the weekend gross. Combined, premium large-format screens of all kinds accounted for well over a third of the film's opening weekend revenue, a striking figure that underscores how much of Interstellar's domestic audience actively sought out an enhanced viewing experience rather than settling for a standard multiplex screening. Despite not claiming the top box office position on its debut weekend, Interstellar nonetheless holds a notable distinction. It ranks as the 7th highest grossing film in North American box office history to have opened without reaching the number 1 position, a testament to the film's remarkable staying power even after ceding the opening weekend crown to an animated family film with broader 4-quadrant appeal. The film's domestic run and gradual decline. Interstellar's box office trajectory in North America followed the fairly typical pattern of a prestige adult drama competing against family-oriented and franchise-driven entertainment. In its second weekend, the film slipped to third place behind both the still-strong Big Hero 6 and the debut of the comedy sequel Dumb and Dumber 2, experiencing a weekend-to-weekend decline of 39% and earning $29 million, which brought its cumulative two-weekend domestic total to $98 million. IMAX screens continued to contribute meaningfully during this stretch, adding $7.4 million from 368 IMAX locations in the second weekend alone. By the third weekend, the film had fallen further, earning $15 million while remaining in third place, this time trailing both the continuing success of Big Hero 6 and the arrival of The Hunger Games, Mockingjay, Part 1, whose franchise pull and built-in fan base proved difficult for any competing release to overcome during that period. This gradual weekend-over-weekend decline is unremarkable in isolation. Nearly all films experience diminishing returns as their release window matures, but it illustrates the competitive pressure Interstellar faced from multiple directions simultaneously: family animation on one side, broad comedy on another, and finally a dominant young adult franchise property that would go on to define much of the box office landscape through the remainder of that autumn. A genuinely global phenomenon. Where Interstellar's commercial story becomes most compelling is in its performance outside North America, where the film did not merely perform well but actively dominated the international box office landscape for a sustained stretch of its release calendar. The film held the top position in the worldwide box office rankings outside North America for 2 consecutive weekends before finally being displaced by the international rollout of The Hunger Games, Mockingjay, Part 1. The United Kingdom release, which included Ireland and Malta as part of the same regional rollout, saw the film debut at number 1 with an opening weekend gross of £5.5 million, translating to approximately $8.6 million. While this was a strong result by most measures, it fell short of the openings achieved by several other prestige and franchise blockbusters in the same territory, including The Dark Knight Rises at £14.4 million, the space survival thriller Gravity at £6.2 million, and Nolan's own earlier film Inception at £5.9 million. A comparison that places Interstellar's UK debut in solid but not record-breaking territory relative to films with which it shares thematic or directorial DNA. The film's release strategy extended rapidly across the globe, debuting in 35 separate markets on a single day, a rollout that included major territories such as Germany, Russia, Australia, and Brazil, which collectively generated $8.7 million on that day alone. By the conclusion of its first full international weekend, encompassing the Sunday of that opening frame, Interstellar had accumulated $83 million from an estimated 11.1 million admissions, spread across more than 14,800 screens in a total of 62 markets worldwide. Figures that illustrate just how extensively the film's distribution had been planned to maximize simultaneous global exposure. IMAX contributed $7.3 million of that total from 206 IMAX screens internationally, averaging roughly 35,400 admissions per participating theater, a remarkably high per-screen average that speaks to the format's popularity with international audiences eager to experience the film's space sequences on the largest possible canvas. Individual market performances varied considerably, offering a window into how different national audiences responded to the film's particular blend of hard science fiction and emotional family drama. Interstellar claimed the top box office position in South Korea, where it earned $14.4 million in its opening period, as well as in Russia, with $8.9 million, and France, with $5.3 million. Strong, if slightly smaller, openings were recorded in Germany at $4.6 million, India at $4.3 million, Italy at $3.7 million, and Australia, also at $3.7 million. Spain generated $2.7 million, Mexico $3.1 million, and Brazil $1.9 million, each result respectable within its respective market context, even if none matched the scale of the South Korean or Russian openings. The China factor. Among all of Interstellar's international markets, China stands out as a particularly significant chapter in the film's commercial narrative, both for the raw scale of the numbers involved and for what they represented in the context of Nolan's career and Warner Brothers' broader strategy in the territory. The film opened in China on November 12, generating $5.4 million on its opening day, a Wednesday, which at the time represented the largest single-day opening of Nolan's career in the Chinese market, surpassing the previous benchmark of $4.61 million set by The Dark Knight Rises. The momentum continued through the opening weekend, with the film ultimately earning $41.7 million over that period and capturing an extraordinary 55% share of the entire Chinese box office market during those 3 days, a dominant position that left every other film in wide release scrambling for the remaining share. This performance made Interstellar not only Nolan's most successful opening in China to that point but also Warner Brothers' single biggest two-dimensional opening in the territory, and the third largest opening of any kind in the studio's history in China, trailing only the fantasy blockbuster The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies, which had opened to $49.5 million, and the giant monster vs. robot spectacle Pacific Rim, which had debuted to $45 million the previous year. When its Chinese theatrical run concluded on December 12, roughly 1 month after opening, Interstellar had accumulated a total of $122.6 million in that market alone, a figure that placed China among the film's most important territories worldwide. Beyond China, the film's largest individual markets outside North America were South Korea, the United Kingdom, including Ireland and Malta, and the combined region of Russia and the Commonwealth of Independent States. South Korea proved to be an exceptionally strong market for the film overall, with total earnings there reaching $73.4 million, a figure substantial enough that within just 31 days of release, Interstellar had already become the 13th most successful film in South Korean box office history and the third most successful foreign film ever released in the country, trailing only Avatar, which had drawn 13.3 million admissions, and Disney's Frozen, which had drawn 10.3 million. Interstellar itself drew an estimated 9.1 million admissions in South Korea, a remarkable figure for a mid-budget science fiction drama competing against considerably more family-friendly or spectacle-driven predecessors on that same all-time list. The UK, Ireland, and Malta collectively contributed $31.3 million to the film's total haul, while Russia and the CIS region added a further $19 million, rounding out the trio of markets that, alongside China, defined the international backbone of Interstellar's theatrical success, home media, and an unwanted distinction. Following the conclusion of its theatrical run, Interstellar made the transition to home media with a release date of March 31, 2015, arriving simultaneously in both the United Kingdom and the United States. The film performed strongly in this new market as well, topping home video sales charts for a combined total of 2 weeks following its release, a strong showing that reflected continued consumer enthusiasm for owning the film even after its theatrical window had closed. Nearly 3 years later, on December 19, 2017, the film received a further home media release in the Ultra HD Blu-ray format, allowing audiences to experience the film's meticulously composed visuals in high dynamic range and increased resolution, a fitting format upgrade for a film so heavily built around large-scale visual spectacle originally designed for IMAX presentation. The home media chapter of Interstellar's commercial life was not, however, without its complications. The film also earned a far less flattering distinction in 2015. It was reported to be the most pirated film of that year, with an estimated 46.7 million illegal downloads recorded via BitTorrent networks alone. This figure, staggering in its scale, speaks to the tension that persists between a film's official commercial performance and its unauthorized consumption, and it underscores just how widely Interstellar had permeated global popular culture in the period following its theatrical release, reaching audiences, for better or worse, through channels entirely outside the studio's control or profit structure. A commercial portrait of a modern blockbuster. Taken together, these figures paint a portrait of Interstellar as a film that succeeded not through the guaranteed commercial safety net of franchise recognition or pre-existing intellectual property, but through the combined draw of Christopher Nolan's directorial reputation, and starry ensemble cast, and an aggressive, format-forward exhibition strategy that leaned heavily on IMAX and premium large-format screens to maximize per-ticket revenue even as overall attendance faced stiff competition from family and franchise releases. Its box office performance, dominant internationally, competitive but not chart-topping domestically, historically significant in IMAX specifically, reflects the particular commercial position occupied by original, big-budget science fiction in the mid-2010s, capable of extraordinary global reach, yet still operating within a marketplace increasingly structured around sequels, franchises, and family-friendly four-quadrant appeal. That Interstellar nonetheless managed to set IMAX records, dominate multiple national box office charts, and remain a cultural touchstone years after its release, despite a relatively modest net profit margin by studio accounting standards, speaks to the enduring commercial and cultural value of ambitious, original filmmaking even within an industry increasingly skeptical of it. When Christopher Nolan assembled the cast of Interstellar, he was not simply filling roles in a science fiction spectacle, he was constructing a set of emotional counterweights that would keep an audience tethered to a story that otherwise spans galaxies, decades, and dimensions. At the center sits Matthew McConaughey's Joseph "Coop" Cooper, a former test pilot whose ambitions were grounded, quite literally, when a failing agricultural world no longer had use for engineers and explorers. McConaughey came to the role fresh off an Academy Award win, and the casting mattered beyond prestige. Audiences needed to believe that a man capable of extraordinary competence could also be an ordinary, frustrated father, someone who talks to his daughter about ghosts in her bookshelf before he ever talks to NASA about wormholes. The performance works because McConaughey plays Cooper's homesickness as something physical, almost a chronic ache, so that when the character eventually drifts away from Earth at relativistic speed, the audience feels the distance in years and heartbeats rather than in light years. Opposite him, and Hathaway's Dr. Amelia Brand provides a different register of longing. Brand is the daughter of the mission's architect, and her arc is shaped by a private, almost embarrassing hope that love might be a variable worth trusting even when it cannot be measured. Hathaway plays this without softening Brand's professionalism. She is a scientist first, and her insistence that affection might carry information a graph cannot is framed as a genuine hypothesis rather than sentimental wish fulfillment. The friction between Cooper's paternal devotion and Brand's romantic devotion gives the film two competing emotional gravities, which mirrors, on a human scale, the actual gravitational puzzles the plot revolves around. The Cooper family itself is where the film's emotional physics are most exposed. Murphy Cooper is played across 3 ages and by 3 different performers, a structural choice that turns her into something like a relay baton passed between actresses rather than a single continuous character. Mackenzie Foy establishes her as a fiercely intelligent, wounded child who refuses to accept that her father is simply going. Jessica Chastain carries her into adulthood as a scientist who inherits her father's stubbornness and redirects it towards solving the very equation that stranded him, and Ellen Burstyn appears briefly as an elderly muff recounting the whole affair from the vantage of an impossibly long life. The choice to split one character among three actors is unusual, and it works because the film is fundamentally about time doing violence to relationships. A father can leave for what feels like a few years and return to find his child has aged past him. Casey Affleck's Tom, and Timothée Chalamet playing his teenage incarnation, receive comparatively less screen time, but they matter structurally as the sibling who stays, who inherits the farm rather than the stars, and whose slower, sadder arc absorbs the cost of Cooper's absence in a way Muff's redemptive arc does not. Michael Caine's Professor Brand functions as the film's moral hinge, a mentor figure who withholds a devastating truth from Cooper for what he believes are defensible reasons. Caine, a Nolan regular by this point, brings a paternal warmth to the role that makes the character's eventual duplicity sting rather than merely shock. The supporting astronaut corps, including Wes Bentley's Doyle and David Gaius's Rumley, exist largely to give the Endurance crew a sense of camaraderie and expendability, while Matt Damon's late film appearance as Dr. Mann is deliberately withheld from marketing, allowing the film to spring a betrayal on audiences who had been trained by trailers to expect a more straightforward voyage of discovery. Damon's casting against type, as a decorated hero who turns out to be a coward willing to sacrifice the whole mission for rescue, is one of the film's sharper structural jokes. The actor most associated with competent, trustworthy protagonists is repurposed as a study in how isolation and fear corrode even genuine heroism. Perhaps the most quietly affecting performances in the film come from Bill Irwin, whose voice and puppetry work brings the robots Tars and Case to life. Irwin, a performer trained in physical theater and clowning, gives Tars a mechanical body language that somehow reads as sardonic without ever approaching cartoonish comic relief. Tars becomes the film's emotional shock absorber, delivering deadpan honesty in moments when the human characters are too frightened or too proud to speak plainly, and its willingness to sacrifice itself later in the film lands with real weight precisely because Irwin's performance made the machine feel like a companion rather than a prop. From a blind date to a blockbuster, the long road to production. Interstellar's origin story is unusually intimate for a film of its scale. Producer Linda Obst and theoretical physicist Kip Thorne had collaborated once before, on the 1997 film Contact, and their working relationship traced back to a blind date arranged by Carl Sagan. Years later, the two began imagining a project built around Thorne's actual research into wormholes, black holes, and the outer limits of general relativity, framed as a story about making the most exotic phenomena in the universe suddenly reachable by human beings. That premise attracted Steven Spielberg, who signed on to direct in the mid-2000s, with Paramount backing an early treatment. Jonathan Nolan, rather than his better-known brother, was the first Nolan involved, brought on to turn the 8-page pitch into an actual screenplay. The project might have stayed a Spielberg film indefinitely had studio politics not intervened. When Spielberg relocated his production company from Paramount to Disney, the film lost its director, and Paramount needed to find a replacement for a project that had already accumulated years of physics consultation and screenplay drafts. Jonathan Nolan's suggestion of his brother Christopher was, in a sense, an accident of proximity. Christopher had been orbiting the project informally simply because his brother was writing it, and when it became clear Spielberg might depart, the elder Nolan's interest was already primed. Once Christopher Nolan came aboard, he did what he has done on several of his other projects. He met directly with the scientific consultant, in this case sitting down with Thorne to work through how space-time itself might be dramatized rather than merely explained. He also began merging his own instincts with his brother's existing draft, effectively blending two screenwriting sensibilities into a single script. The business arrangement behind the film reveals just how much Interstellar was a negotiated compromise between studios that don't normally cooperate. Warner Brothers, a traditional rival of Paramount, wanted a stake in what was clearly shaping up to be a prestige, awards-caliber production from one of the industry's most bankable directors. The two studios brokered an unusually elaborate trade. Warner Brothers secured co-financing rights on Interstellar, while in exchange Paramount received a stake in a future Friday the 13th sequel and a piece of a prospective South Park film, the franchise's first since 1999. Paramount was also promised a share in an unspecified A-list property down the line, suggesting the studios viewed the whole arrangement as an ongoing, if awkward, alliance rather than a single transaction. Legendary Pictures then entered the picture, agreeing to finance roughly a quarter of the budget, reportedly in exchange for stepping back from its long-running production partnership with Warner Brothers and giving up its option to help finance Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. In other words, one of the most personally driven, scientifically grounded films of the decade was born out of a tangle of favor trading among three major studios, each hedging against the other's leverage. Nolan's reported deal, a salary in the tens of millions against a percentage of the gross, reflected his standing after the commercial and critical success of the Dark Knight trilogy and Inception. It also gave him considerable creative latitude, which he used to insist on shooting on location wherever feasible, favoring practical effects, IMAX photography, and location work over the reliance on green screen that had become standard for effects-heavy studio films. His visits to NASA and to SpaceX during pre-production were not simply publicity gestures. They shaped the film's insistence on plausible engineering details, from the design of the Endurance spacecraft to the physical mechanics of docking sequences that were staged with rotating sets rather than pure digital compositing. Gravity, love, and the limits of data. Thematically, Interstellar occupies a strange position among science fiction epics. It is simultaneously one of the most scientifically rigorous mainstream films ever made and one of the most openly sentimental. Thorne's involvement ensured that the depiction of the black hole gargantua, the effects of gravitational time dilation, and the behavior of a wormhole were rendered with an unusual degree of fidelity, to the point that the visualization of the black hole informed subsequent academic publications about how such objects would actually appear. Yet layered directly on top of this rigor is a persistent argument, voiced most explicitly by Brand, that love might function as a force that operates outside the instruments available to measure it. Nolan never resolves this tension neatly. The plot ultimately hinges not on romantic intuition but on a data transfer accomplished through gravity manipulated by a future, higher-dimensional version of humanity, which suggests love is less a physical force in its own right than a motivating pressure that leads characters toward the correct data. The film wants to have both, a universe that obeys precise physical law and a universe in which paternal devotion is powerful enough to bend that law's outcomes. This duality is why Interstellar provokes such divided reactions. For some audiences, the scientific scaffolding legitimizes the emotional payoff, making Cooper's tearful return to his dying, elderly daughter feel earned rather than manipulative, because the mechanism, relativistic time dilation, is real physics rather than magic. For others, the film's insistence on marrying hard science with an almost mystical faith in familial love feels like an uneasy tonal compromise, ambition without full commitment to either the coldness of hard science fiction or the warmth of pure melodrama. The film's harshest critics have argued that its scope, 3 astronauts, a resource-starved Earth, multiple candidate planets, a fifth-dimensional tesseract, and a rescue versus sacrifice moral dilemma, spreads its ideas so widely that none receive the depth they deserve, leaving an impression of vastness that doesn't always survive close scrutiny. Interstellar's theatrical run illustrates the gap between an event film's cultural footprint and its raw commercial performance. The production budget, reported around $165 million before marketing costs, demanded a substantial global gross simply to break even once prints, advertising, and talent participations were factored in. Paramount had projected an opening weekend near $50 million domestically, a number the studio was forced to revise downward as the film's actual debut came in several million short of that estimate, landing instead in the mid-$40 million range. The film also had to contend with Big Hero 6, an animated family film that outperformed it domestically on opening weekend, a fact that generated a round of trade press hand-wringing about whether Nolan's ambitions had overreached the mainstream audience's appetite. Several factors were blamed for the softer-than-expected domestic launch. At nearly 3 hours, the film's runtime limited the number of screenings theaters could schedule each day, directly constraining ticket sales regardless of demand. Reviews, while largely positive, were more mixed than the near-unanimous acclaim that had greeted Nolan's previous features. On aggregate review platforms, the film settled in the mid-70s% range, respectable but not the award season sweep some had predicted. Audience polling handed the film a solid but unspectacular grade, identical to the grade Inception had received, suggesting that general audiences respected the film without uniformly loving it. Analysts at the time pointed to a broader pattern. Ambitious, cerebral blockbusters like Interstellar, Inception, and Gravity tend to build their grosses gradually through weekday holds and word of mouth rather than exploding on opening weekend and fading quickly, and Interstellar's own numbers bore this out, with a notably strong Monday hold that suggested older, more patient audiences were turning out on weekdays. Despite the underwhelming opening, the film's global performance eventually justified the investment, with worldwide grosses climbing well past the budget's demands and the film becoming one of the highest-grossing entries of the year internationally, alongside particularly strong returns in IMAX presentations, where its scale and sound design were considered to have been created specifically for that theatrical format. Trade analyses conducted after the fact, however, noted that once talent participations, marketing spend, and financing splits among Paramount, Warner Brothers, and Legendary were accounted for, Interstellar ranked surprisingly far down the list of the year's most profitable titles, a reminder that headline box office totals often obscure how thin the actual margins are on a film of this scale and prestige. Critical reception and long-term reputation. Contemporary reviews of Interstellar split along a fairly consistent fault line. Critics who admired Nolan's willingness to build a mainstream blockbuster around genuine astrophysics and unabashed emotion, and critics who felt the film's scientific ambition curdled into over-explanation, with characters pausing at moments of maximum tension to deliver dialogue that functioned more as physics lecture than as drama. The film's visual and sonic craftsmanship, however, drew far more consistent praise. Hans Zimmer's score, built around a pipe organ rather than his more typical brass and percussion approach, was widely singled out as one of the most distinctive elements of the production, lending scenes of docking maneuvers and wormhole transit a church-like, almost liturgical quality that reinforced the film's undercurrent of awe. The cinematography, shot largely on 35mm and 65mm film rather than digital, and the decision to build physical, practical sets for the Endurance's interior rather than relying purely on green screen, were frequently cited as reasons the film's space sequences felt tactile in a way that many contemporaneous effects-driven blockbusters did not. In the decade since its release, Interstellar's reputation has, if anything, grown. Its theatrical re-releases on its various anniversaries have consistently drawn audiences back into cinemas, particularly in IMAX, suggesting a film whose ideal viewing conditions were always closer to a planetarium experience than a home screen. It now regularly appears among the most popular titles on audience-driven platforms and retains a very high user rating on aggregation sites, even as some critical retrospectives have argued that its emotional bluntness, wearing its themes on its sleeve rather than trusting an audience to intuit them, is simultaneously the source of its mass appeal and the reason it falls short of the more ambiguous, layered status of Nolan's other prestige work. That very tension, a film both widely beloved and considered by some critics to be intellectually overstuffed, has become part of its identity. Interstellar is less often discussed as a flawless film than as an unusually sincere and unusually rigorous attempt to make audiences feel the scale of the universe and the smallness of a single act of love within it. Legacy within Nolan's body of work. Positioned between the abstract dream architecture of Inception and the historical intimacy of Dunkirk, Interstellar stands as the moment Nolan's career pivoted most explicitly towards science as subject matter rather than science as backdrop. Where Inception used the language of physics loosely, as a structuring metaphor for memory and guilt, Interstellar treated Thorne's equations as load-bearing plot mechanics, a choice that would echo forward into Tenet's obsession with entropy and time inversion. The film also cemented a recurring Nolan preoccupation: fathers who leave, and the children who spend the rest of their lives working through the consequences of that departure, a theme that surfaces again, in different clothing, throughout his filmography. For a project that began as a collaborative daydream between a producer and a physicist who met on a blind date, Interstellar's afterlife, its influence on how black holes are visualized, its enduring IMAX audience, and its place in ongoing arguments about where blockbuster cinema's emotional and intellectual ambitions should sit, suggests that its reach ultimately exceeded even its own considerable grasp. Long before Christopher Nolan's name was attached to Interstellar, his brother Jonathan had already spent years living inside the project, and that duration shows in the finished film's texture. Jonathan Nolan's 4-year process was not simply a matter of drafting and redrafting dialogue, it involved something closer to an informal graduate education. He enrolled himself in the study of relativity at Caltech, working alongside the physicists who would eventually formalize the film's approach to black holes and time dilation, so that the science embedded in the script wasn't decoration borrowed secondhand from other films but something he had wrestled with directly. This mattered because it shaped the tone of pessimism that runs beneath the film's early scenes. Jonathan was writing during a period when the Space Shuttle program had just been retired and NASA's public appetite for crewed exploration beyond low Earth orbit seemed to be evaporating, and he folded that real disappointment into the screenplay's premise, a near future where humanity has quietly given up on space rather than been driven from it by catastrophe. He drew on the atmosphere of apocalyptic science fiction that surrounded him at the time, citing the scorched earth industrial collapse of Wall-E and the ecological reckoning of Avatar as touchstones, though Interstellar's blight ultimately reads less like a spectacular disaster and more like a slow, agricultural exhaustion, closer to famine than to explosion. A journalist covering the film's development captured this tonal choice well, describing the world Jonathan built as a dystopia populated not by despairing survivors but by stubborn, hardy people determined to keep farming through a crisis that refuses to announce itself as an emergency. That distinction, quiet erosion rather than sudden apocalypse, is arguably the screenplay's most successful choice, because it allows the film's first act to feel like a character study of rural resilience rather than a disaster movie prologue. When Christopher Nolan took over as director, he inherited an unusual problem, not a thin script needing to be built up, but an overstuffed one requiring triage. He has described his task less as writing from scratch and more as selecting, from the abundance of ideas his brother and Kip Thorne had generated, whichever threads he believed he could communicate clearly to a mass audience without losing them along the way. This editorial instinct led him to cut material he later second-guessed. An early version of the script, for instance, had characters detect the film's central wormhole through gravitational waves, a plausible piece of theoretical physics at the time but one Nolan removed for reasons of narrative clarity. The decision became a point of professional irony for him. Just over a year after Interstellar's release, the LIGO Observatory announced the first direct detection of gravitational waves, retroactively vindicating the very mechanism he had cut from the film. What Nolan chose to keep, rather than cut, tells its own story about his priorities as a director. He preserved his brother's opening act nearly intact, the hour set entirely on Earth before any spacecraft leaves the ground, because it grounded the family drama that would later have to carry the emotional weight of an interstellar journey. That Earthbound section draws directly on the Dust Bowl, the prolonged agricultural catastrophe that devastated the American Great Plains during the 1930s. Nolan's engagement with that history went beyond research reading. He watched Ken Burns's 2012 documentary on the subject and was struck enough by its first-hand interview footage that he contacted Burns and producer Dayton Duncan directly, requesting permission to weave portions of their subject's actual recollections into his fictional frame. The result is a formal experiment. Elderly witnesses describing a real ecological disaster from 80 years earlier appear, unlabeled as documentary footage within the story, as if they were simply neighbors of the Cooper family recalling the blight consuming their own crops. It is a technique that blurs the line between archival memory and invented future history, and it gives the film's opening scenes a documentary authority that a purely fictional framing device could not have manufactured on its own. Finding Cooper, finding Brand. Casting Interstellar's lead required Nolan to solve a specific problem: how to find an actor capable of embodying an everyman intelligent enough to serve as an engineer and pilot, but accessible enough that audiences would feel they were experiencing the film's cosmic events through his eyes rather than watching a remote, invulnerable hero undergo them. Nolan found his answer somewhat by accident. He had watched an early cut of Mud, the 2012 drama in which Matthew McConaughey played a fugitive hiding out on a river island, not because he was scouting the actor for a role but because he was personally close to one of that film's producers. What he saw convinced him that McConaughey possessed exactly the blend of weathered vulnerability and quiet authority Cooper required. Rather than simply extending an offer through conventional channels, Nolan made the somewhat unusual choice to visit McConaughey directly on the set of the television series True Detective, meeting him in the middle of an entirely different production to make his case in person. And Hathaway's casting followed a different, more intimate route. Instead of receiving the script through an agent or a formal audition process, she was invited into Nolan's own home, where she read the screenplay in a setting clearly designed to convey both the project's secrecy and its personal significance to the director. Both she and McConaughey were confirmed for their roles in early 2013, cementing the emotional axis of paternal devotion and romantic hope that the finished film would balance against each other. Jessica Chastain's involvement came together while she was on location in Northern Ireland filming Miss Julie, where a script for Interstellar was delivered to her mid-production, a logistical detail that underscores how much international scheduling had to be coordinated simply to assemble this ensemble. Not every approach succeeded. Actor Irfan Khan was offered a role in the film but had to decline due to conflicting commitments, a reminder that even a project of this scale and prestige had to compete for talent against overlapping calendars. Matt Damon's casting as Dr. Mann came together comparatively late, finalized in the final days of August 2013, and his contribution to the production was compressed into a single, isolated stretch of filming in Iceland, a schedule that mirrored his character's own isolation within the story. Shooting on film, shooting for real. Nolan's approach to Interstellar's physical production reflected a consistent, almost stubborn preference for tactile, analog craftsmanship over digital shortcuts. The film was captured on 35mm stock in the anamorphic Panavision format, supplemented extensively by 70mm IMAX photography, and Nolan deployed more IMAX cameras on this production than on any of his previous films, a choice that demanded enormous logistical planning given how large and heavy that equipment is compared with standard digital or even standard film cameras. Behind the camera was Hoyt van Hoytema rather than Wally Pfister, who had shot every one of Nolan's films up to that point. Pfister's absence was not a falling out but a scheduling reality. He was directing his own film, Transcendence, that same year, and would go on to step away from cinematography as a profession afterward. Van Hoytema's arrival brought a fresh technical problem-solving instinct to the production. He modified an IMAX camera so it could be operated handheld for interior sequences, a retrofit that allowed the notoriously bulky format to be used in the tighter, more mobile shots the Endurance's cramped interiors required. In one especially audacious sequence, the crew mounted an IMAX camera inside the nose cone of a Learjet to capture footage that would have been prohibitively difficult, or impossible, to replicate convincingly through visual effects alone. Nolan's insistence on secrecy during production was, by this point in his career, something close to a signature. A Wall Street Journal report on the production noted that he protected the Interstellar script with the same extreme caution he had applied years earlier to the Dark Knight trilogy, restricting access and controlling information about the plot as tightly as a studio might guard a genuine national secret. As one layer of that secrecy, the production was shot under a deliberately misleading cover title, Flora's Letter, a name drawn from Flora, one of the 4 children Nolan has with his producing partner and wife, Emma Thomas. The disguise served the practical purpose of keeping call sheets, permits, and local press inquiries from tipping off the film's true identity before Nolan was ready to reveal it, building an Earth worth leaving. Principal photography was budgeted to run 4 months and began on August 6, 2013, in the Canadian province of Alberta, spread across several small towns including Nanton, Longview, Lethbridge, Fort Macleod, and Okotoks. In Okotoks specifically, the production made use of the Siemens Stadium and the town's Oldie Town Plaza, folding existing civic architecture into the film's vision of a near-future farming community rather than building an entirely artificial set from nothing. The production's commitment to physical realism reached an almost agricultural scale. Production designer Nathan Crowley oversaw the planting of 500 acres of corn specifically so that it could later be destroyed on camera in an apocalyptic dust storm sequence, a decision that meant the crew was, in effect, farming a real crop for the sole purpose of annihilating it convincingly on film. Additional dust storm sequences centered on McConaughey's character were shot separately in Fort Macleod, where the production manufactured its own weather, using large industrial fans to propel cellulose-based synthetic dust through the air in a controlled recreation of the choking storms that plagued the American Great Plains in the 1930s. The Alberta shoot wrapped on September 9, 2013, and had involved hundreds of background extras alongside a crew of roughly 130 people, the majority of whom were hired locally, embedding the production directly into the regional economy and workforce rather than importing an entirely outside crew. From Alberta, the production moved to Iceland, a location Nolan already knew well from shooting portions of Batman Begins there nearly a decade earlier. Iceland's otherworldly terrain was tasked with representing not one but 2 separate extraterrestrial worlds within the story, an icy planet and a water-covered planet, requiring the crew to physically transport spaceship replicas weighing roughly 10,000 pounds across the landscape to stage the illusion of alien landings. The Icelandic leg of the shoot lasted about 2 weeks and involved a crew of approximately 350 people, of whom around 130 were local hires, working across locations that included the Svinafellsjökull Glacier and the nearby town of Klauster. Not everything went according to plan. Safety concerns forced the cancellation of a planned shooting day directly on the glacier itself, and the production adapted by relocating close-up shots of a physical confrontation between Cooper and Mann to the comparatively mundane setting of a motel parking lot, which crews painted to visually approximate the glacier's icy surface for the camera. The Icelandic shoot also produced one of the production's more alarming near misses, while filming a water-based sequence, and Hathaway's dry suit had not been properly sealed, and she came close to hypothermia in the frigid conditions before the issue was caught. The production's final stretch took place in Los Angeles, where the crew spent 54 days filming across a mix of urban and suburban locations, including the Westin Bonaventure Hotel and Suites, the Los Angeles Convention Center, a soundstage at Sony Pictures in Culver City, and a private residence in Altadena, California, that stood in for portions of the story's domestic scenes. Principal photography concluded in December 2013, closing out a shoot that had carried the production from the manufactured dust storms of the Canadian prairies to the glacial ice of Iceland and finally back to conventional sound stages and city locations in Southern California. The completed budget landed at $165 million, itself $10 million below what Paramount, Warner Brothers, and Legendary Pictures had originally allotted for the production, a modest underrun that stands out given how physically ambitious, and geographically scattered, the shoot had actually been. Crafter's argument. What emerges from Interstellar's writing and production history is a consistent philosophy. that a story about the outer edges of physics earns its emotional claims by grounding itself in physical, verifiable labor wherever possible. Jonathan Nolan's years of study at Caltech and Christopher Nolan's insistence on shooting real cornfields, real glacier, and real 70mm film stock all serve the same underlying argument, that a film willing to gamble on genuine science and genuine locations has more standing to ask an audience to believe in its emotional leaps than one relying purely on digital abstraction. The choice to fold real Dust Bowl testimony into a fictional future, the decision to chase a lead actor onto the set of an entirely different show, the willingness to destroy 500 acres of planted corn for a few minutes of screen time, all of these production choices function less as trivia and more as evidence of a filmmaking process that treated authenticity, however expensive or logistically punishing, as inseparable from the story's ultimate claim that love and physics might, in the end, be speaking the same language. Reversing the usual order of effects work. One of the quieter but more consequential decisions in Interstellar's production was procedural rather than aesthetic, the order in which the visual effects were made relative to the live-action photography. The effects house DNEG, which had already worked with Christopher Nolan on Inception, returned for Interstellar, and visual effects supervisor Paul Franklin has pointed out that the sheer volume of effects work on this film wasn't dramatically larger than what his team had handled on The Dark Knight Rises or Inception. What set Interstellar apart wasn't quantity but sequencing. Rather than following the conventional blockbuster workflow, in which actors perform in front of blank green screens and the visual effects are composite in afterward based on rough pre-visualization, Nolan's team built finished digital environments first and then projected those images on massive screens behind the actors during filming itself. This meant that when McConaughey or Hathaway looked out of a cockpit window at a wormhole or an alien horizon, they were, for the most part, actually looking at that imagery in real time on set rather than performing against nothing and imagining it. The technique produced more convincing eye lines and lighting interactions between the actors' faces and their supposed surroundings, since the light from the projected backgrounds genuinely fell across their skin rather than being added digitally after the fact. The scale of the resulting effects work was still considerable by any ordinary measure. The finished film contains 850 individual visual effects shots, rendered at a resolution far beyond standard high-definition delivery, reflecting the demands of IMAX presentation. Of those shots, roughly 150 were achieved in camera through the projection technique described above, meaning the visual information was captured directly during photography rather than assembled digitally afterward. The remaining majority, around 700 shots, were completed in post-production through more conventional digital compositing and animation. A significant portion of the total, 620 shots, was specifically formatted and finished for IMAX's larger frame and aspect ratio, while the balance was prepared in the anamorphic widescreen format used for standard theatrical presentation. This split reflects how thoroughly IMAX considerations shaped the production from the outset rather than being treated as an afterthought or a marketing add-on. Spaceships you could actually touch. Nowhere is Nolan's preference for physical, tangible filmmaking more visible than in the construction of the film's spacecraft. The Ranger, the Endurance module, and the various lander vehicles were built as physical miniatures rather than generated purely as computer models, a job undertaken by production designer Nathan Crowley in partnership with the effects house New Deal Studios. Nolan's stated reasoning was straightforward. He believed physical models, however painstakingly built, would register on camera with a weight and presence that digital geometry, however sophisticated, still struggled to replicate convincingly, particularly in the way light behaves across real metal, real seams, and real surface imperfections. The resulting models were extraordinary in scale, so much so that the crew coined an informal nickname for them, Maxatures, a play on the word miniature that acknowledged how enormous these supposedly small-scale objects actually were. The Endurance module, built at 1/15th scale, still measured more than 25 feet across, while a separate, pyrotechnic rigged section of the same craft, built specifically so it could be safely destroyed on camera, was constructed at a much larger 1/5th scale. The Ranger and Lander vehicles were even larger in absolute terms, spanning roughly 46 and 49 feet respectively, dimensions that placed them closer to the size of small aircraft than to conventional tabletop models. The sheer size of these builds unlocked a filming technique that smaller models could never have supported. Cinematographer Hoyt van Hoytema was able to physically mount IMAX cameras directly onto the miniatures themselves, capturing footage from a vantage point essentially inside or attached to the spacecraft. This approach deliberately echoed the visual language of genuine NASA-produced IMAX documentaries, footage that Nolan's team studied closely, in which cameras are mounted on real spacecraft and shuttles to capture point-of-view perspectives unavailable from any external vantage. To choreograph the motion of these massive models convincingly, the production rigged them to a 6-axis gimbal connected to a motion control system, allowing an operator to program precise, repeatable movements. These maneuvers were then filmed against separately shot background plates depicting starfields and planetary surfaces, captured using VistaVision cameras mounted on a second, smaller motion control rig, so that the miniature's movement and the background's movement could be synchronized frame by frame in post-production. In total, New Deal Studios' physical miniature work accounted for roughly 150 of the film's visual effects shots, a modest fraction of the overall 850, but one that shaped the visual identity of the film's spacecraft far more than its numerical share would suggest, since these were the shots audiences remember most vividly. Nolan has been unusually candid about the specific films that shaped Interstellar's visual and tonal identity, describing several works as key touchstones for the project. He has named Metropolis, 2001, A Space Odyssey, Blade Runner, Star Wars, and Alien as foundational reference points, a list that spans nearly the entire history of ambitious science fiction filmmaking, from Fritz Lang's silent-era vision of a mechanized future to Ridley Scott's atmospheric depictions of space as a place of both wonder and dread. Beyond straightforward genre lineage, Nolan has pointed to a more unexpected influence, Andrei Tarkovsky's 1975 film Mirror, which he credits not for its plot or science fiction trappings, since it has none, but for its handling of what he calls elemental forces, wind, dust, and water, as expressive, almost characterful presences within a story. That influence is legible in Interstellar's own treatment of the Dust Bowl-inspired blight sequences. Nolan has also drawn a comparison between Interstellar and John Huston's 1948 film The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, framing both as, at their core, studies of human nature under pressure, suggesting that beneath its space travel premise, Interstellar is equally concerned with how ambition, trust, and self-interest reshape individuals once they are removed from ordinary social constraints. Nolan has also spoken about wanting Interstellar to occupy a specific tonal register associated with Steven Spielberg's 1970s output, citing both Jaws and Close Encounters of the Third Kind as models for a certain kind of blockbuster filmmaking, family-friendly on its surface but genuinely challenging and sharp-edged underneath, rather than smoothed into pure comfort viewing. To calibrate the tone and craft of the astronaut sequences specifically, Nolan screened Philip Kaufman's The Right Stuff for his cast and crew before production began, and the influence of that earlier film's visual approach shows up directly in Interstellar's treatment of its astronauts' helmet visors, which frequently catch and reflect their surroundings in a manner that mirrors The Right Stuff's own iconic imagery of test pilots and early astronauts. To further ground the production in a genuine sense of spaceflight culture, Nolan invited former NASA astronaut Marsha Ivins onto the set during filming, giving his cast direct access to someone who had actually experienced the disorientation, procedure, and physicality of real space missions. The production's visual research extended specifically to the IMAX documentary work of filmmaker Tony Myers, whose NASA-focused films provided a template for shooting inside cramped spacecraft interiors using oversized IMAX equipment, a technical challenge Interstellar's own crew had to solve using very similar solutions. Not every influence on the film came from outer space or from other films at all. The Midwestern farm setting that opens Interstellar draws, somewhat surprisingly, from the depiction of Clark Kent's rural upbringing in the 2013 Superman film Man of Steel, a connection that speaks to how thoroughly interconnected contemporary blockbuster visual language had become by the time Interstellar entered production, with one Warner Brothers franchise informally cross-pollinating another. Nolan's influences extended into architecture as well. He has cited the work of modernist architect Ludwig Mies van der Rohe as a source of inspiration, a nod toward the clean, functional geometry that characterizes much of the film's spacecraft and interior production design, favoring stark utilitarian lines over the more ornate, cluttered aesthetic common to other science fiction universes. Kip Thorne's rules of engagement. The scientific architecture underpinning Interstellar owes its credibility almost entirely to theoretical physicist Kip Thorne, whose involvement went well beyond the ceremonial role a science advisor sometimes plays on a Hollywood production. Thorne has explained that his direct technical contribution involved working through the actual equations required to trace how light rays would behave as they passed through a wormhole or curved around the gravitational field of a black hole, meaning the resulting visuals audiences see on screen are not artistic guesses dressed up as physics but genuine outputs of Einstein's general relativity equations run through specialized rendering software built specifically for this purpose. Early in his collaboration with the production, Thorne established two guiding principles he wanted the filmmakers to respect. First, nothing depicted in the film would be allowed to violate physical laws that have already been established and confirmed. Second, any speculative extrapolations the story required, ideas that push beyond what is currently proven but remain within the bounds of legitimate scientific hypothesis, needed to originate from genuine scientific reasoning rather than simply being invented by a screenwriter for narrative convenience. Nolan agreed to operate within these constraints, with the practical caveat that scientific rigor could never be allowed to override his ability to actually make the film work as drama. That negotiation between science and storytelling occasionally became a direct standoff. Thorne has recounted spending 2 full weeks in an ongoing argument with Nolan over the director's initial desire to have a character travel faster than the speed of light, a plot device Thorne considered a bridge too far given his own guidelines about respecting established physics. Nolan eventually relented, an outcome that speaks to how seriously the production treated Thorne's authority on matters of physical plausibility even when it constrained the story's options. According to Thorne himself, the single element in the finished film that stretches furthest beyond confirmed science is the depiction of towering, freestanding clouds of ice on one of the planets the astronauts visit, structures whose scale and rigidity would, by any known measure of ice's material strength, be physically impossible to sustain, making this the film's clearest instance of visual imagination outrunning strict scientific defensibility. The scientific community weighs in. Once Interstellar reached audiences, its scientific claims drew scrutiny from working scientists eager to test how well the film's speculative elements held together under real analysis. Astrobiologist David Grinspoon raised pointed objections to the film's depiction of Earth's ecological collapse, arguing that the timeline implied by the story's voracious crop blight was scientifically implausible, since even an extraordinarily aggressive blight would require a span of millions of years, not a single human lifetime, to meaningfully deplete the planet's atmospheric oxygen levels. Grinspoon also flagged the same detail Thorne himself had already conceded as artistic license, noting that the towering ice formations shown on one alien world should, under ordinary gravitational conditions, have long since collapsed under their own weight rather than remaining upright as freestanding structures. Other scientists engaged more with the film's central plot mechanism than with its opening premise. Astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson examined the physics underlying the film's climactic sequence, in which a character interacts with events in the past from within an extra-dimensional space beyond the black hole's event horizon, and concluded that while such interaction with the past is not entirely ruled out by current theory, the honest scientific position is one of humility. Since no one actually knows what conditions exist inside a black hole, the film's speculative leap, however extraordinary, isn't something science can definitively rule impossible. Theoretical physicist Michio Kaku offered some of the most enthusiastic praise the film received from the scientific community, describing it as a production capable of setting a new standard for scientific rigor in science fiction cinema for years to come. Timothy Reyes, a former NASA software engineer who reviewed the film's technical claims, likewise praised the specific handling of black holes, wormholes, and gravitational effects as genuinely excellent, a judgment that carries particular weight given his background in actual aerospace engineering rather than purely theoretical physics. Not every scientific voice was uniformly complimentary. French astrophysicist Jean-Pierre Luminet, notable for having produced one of the very first simulated visual renderings of a black hole decades before Interstellar existed, offered a more mixed assessment. He praised the film's depiction of the warped, gravitationally lensed appearance of the black hole surrounding accretion disk as a genuinely impressive visual and scientific achievement, but was more critical of how the film depicted the interior of the wormhole itself, and noted that several physically accurate effects that Thorne's team had actually modeled were ultimately left out of the black hole's final on-screen rendering, whether for reasons of visual clarity, budget, or dramatic pacing. Luminet's critique is a useful reminder that even a production as scientifically ambitious as Interstellar was still, in the end, a film first and a physics demonstration second, meaning every accurate calculation Thorne's team produced still had to survive a final filter of what actually looked comprehensible and dramatically effective on an IMAX screen. Taken together, Interstellar's visual effects philosophy and its relationship with genuine theoretical physics reveal a production unusually committed to treating scientific accuracy and physical craftsmanship as complementary rather than competing priorities. The choice to build room-size spacecraft models rather than rely purely on digital assets, and the choice to let Kip Thorne's actual relativity equations dictate what a black hole should look like rather than leaving that decision to concept artists' imaginations, both spring from the same underlying instinct, that the film's emotional and dramatic claims would only land if the universe surrounding them felt, and in a meaningful sense actually was, real. The disagreements that emerged along the way, Nolan's reluctant abandonment of faster-than-light travel, Thorne's own acknowledgement that the ice clouds pushed past physical plausibility, Luminet's disappointment that certain accurate renderings were ultimately cut, all point to the same underlying tension that defines the film as a whole, a genuine, sustained negotiation between what is scientifically defensible and what is dramatically necessary, conducted in good faith by people who took both halves of that equation seriously. Interstellar's marketing campaign began with an unusual choice of narrator. Rather than relying on the anonymous, portentous voiceover style typical of blockbuster teasers, Paramount's first teaser trailer, released on December 13, 2013, used Matthew McConaughey's own voice, in character as Cooper, to accompany a montage built almost entirely around the imagery and history of human space exploration. The effect was to sell the film not as a spectacle to be watched from a distance but as an experience to be felt through one specific person's yearning, establishing from the very first promotional material that Interstellar intended to be an intimate story wearing the costume of an epic one. That intimacy didn't come at the expense of scale, however. When the full theatrical trailer debuted several months later, on May 5, 2014, Paramount chose to premiere it at the Lockheed Martin IMAX Theater in Washington, D.C., a venue whose very name tied the film's marketing directly to the aerospace and defense industry rather than to a conventional Hollywood premiere space, reinforcing the sense that Interstellar wanted to be taken seriously as something adjacent to real space exploration rather than pure fantasy. Once that trailer went online later in May, it found an enormous audience remarkably quickly, becoming the single most viewed film trailer online for the week ending May 19, accumulating more than 19.5 million views on YouTube alone, a figure that signaled significant public appetite for the project well before critics or general audiences had seen a single completed scene. Comic-Con, star charts, and a partnership with Google. By the summer of 2014, the promotional campaign shifted from trailers toward direct engagement with fan communities and technology platforms. Christopher Nolan and Matthew McConaughey made their first joint public appearance to promote the film at San Diego Comic-Con in July, a venue that has become an obligatory stop for major genre releases seeking to generate enthusiast buzz well ahead of a wide release. That same month, Paramount launched an interactive website built around a puzzle-like discovery mechanic, inviting users to explore an online experience that ultimately led them to uncover a star chart connected to the Apollo 11 moon landing, a scavenger hunt structure that rewarded curiosity with a piece of space history rather than simply handing out promotional images. The campaign escalated considerably that October, when Paramount entered into a multi-platform promotional partnership with Google. As part of that arrangement, the film's official website was relaunched entirely as a digital hub hosted on Google's own domain infrastructure, a striking arrangement that blurred the line between studio marketing and tech platform branding. This relaunched hub was designed to collect direct feedback from audiences who had seen or were anticipating the film, while also linking out to a companion mobile application. That app included an interactive game allowing users to construct their own models of the solar system and to experiment with a simplified flight simulator modeling space travel, translating some of the film's core preoccupations, orbital mechanics, planetary conditions, the physical challenge of travel between worlds, into something users could manipulate themselves rather than simply watch on screen. The Google partnership extended even further into a kind of collective, participatory art project, a virtual time capsule assembled from content submitted by members of the public, which was ultimately made available for viewing in 2015, effectively inviting Interstellar's audience to leave a message for the future in the same spirit as the film's own themes about messages sent across time and distance. Beyond pure marketing, the Google collaboration also folded in an educational component, with the Google for Education initiative using the film's premise as a hook to promote math and science lesson plans for use in schools, an attempt to convert box office interest into classroom engagement with STEM subjects. Walking through the endurance in virtual reality. Perhaps the most technologically forward-looking element of Interstellar's marketing was a traveling virtual reality experience that let members of the public step inside a digital recreation of the Endurance spacecraft using Oculus Rift headsets, technology that was, at the time, still an emerging and largely unfamiliar novelty to mainstream audiences rather than the widely available consumer product it would later become. Paramount organized this walkthrough as a touring installation, hosting it sequentially across 4 major American cities, New York City, Houston, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C., over a roughly 6-week window running from October 6 through November 19, 2014. The choice of cities was not arbitrary. Houston in particular carries deep symbolic weight as the home of NASA's Mission Control, tying the promotional stop directly to the real history of American human spaceflight that the film's own fictional space agency was built to evoke. Books, a novelization, and a comic prequel. Interstellar's marketing also extended into publishing, generating an unusually broad array of tie-in print material for a single film. Running Press released a behind-the-scenes making-of book titled Interstellar, Beyond Time and Space, written by Mark Kotovaz, on November 11, 2014, offering readers a documentary-style account of the production process itself. In a more unusual move for a science fiction blockbuster, W. Norton & Company, a publisher generally associated with serious non-fiction and academic titles rather than movie tie-ins, released The Science of Interstellar, written by Kip Thorne himself, allowing the film's own scientific consultant to walk general readers through the actual physics underlying the wormholes, black holes, and time dilation depicted on-screen, effectively giving audiences a companion textbook to accompany the fictional narrative. Titan Books handled the more conventional side of tie-in publishing, releasing an official novelization written by Greg Keyes for readers who wanted the story rendered in prose form. Wired magazine contributed its own distinctive piece to the promotional ecosystem, publishing an original online comic titled Absolute Zero, written by Christopher Nolan himself and illustrated by Sean Gordon Murphy. The comic functioned as a prequel to the film's main events, built specifically around Matt Damon's character, Dr. Mann, offering backstory for a character the marketing campaign had otherwise gone to considerable lengths to keep hidden from trailers and promotional imagery. A staggered rollout built around prestige screenings. Before Interstellar reached the general public, Paramount orchestrated a sequence of exclusive screenings designed to build word of mouth among industry insiders and influential audiences first. Paramount's chief executive, Brad Grey, hosted an early private screening on October 19, 2014, at the AMC Lincoln Square IMAX Theater in Manhattan, a venue chosen specifically for its large-format IMAX capability rather than a standard studio screening room. A few days later, on October 22, the studio arranged a first-look screening at the California Science Center, a venue whose scientific, rather than purely entertainment-oriented, identity was clearly meant to reinforce the film's claims to genuine scientific credibility, inviting an audience of established filmmakers and actors from across the industry. The following day, October 23, the film screened at the TCL Chinese Theater in Los Angeles specifically for an audience of more than 900 members of the Screen Actors Guild, a deliberate courting of the Performers Union whose members would go on to discuss the film within their own professional and social circles. The film's official premiere followed on October 26, again at the TCL Chinese Theater, before the production crossed the Atlantic for its European premiere on October 29 at the Odeon Leicester Square in London, a venue long associated with major British film premieres. Chasing an endangered format across the globe. Interstellar's actual public release was staggered deliberately by format rather than simply by geography. The film opened early, on November 4, specifically in theaters capable of projecting 70mm IMAX film, standard 70mm film, or 35mm film, a rollout structure that prioritized venues with genuine film projection capability ahead of the broader digital release. A limited release followed in North America on November 5, before the film expanded into a full-wide release on November 7. Internationally, the staggered rollout continued along similar lines. Belgium, France, and Switzerland received the film on November 5, alongside the North American limited release. For the North American limited release specifically, Interstellar was projected on 70mm or 35mm film stock in 249 theaters that had retained the equipment necessary to support those formats, including at least 41 theaters specifically equipped for 70mm IMAX projection. In one notable instance, Paramount arranged for an actual 70mm IMAX projector to be installed at the TCL Chinese Theater in Los Angeles specifically so the venue could support this exhibition format. Once the wide release began, the film's footprint expanded further into theaters that could only project it digitally, broadening access at the cost of the format purity the studio had emphasized in its initial rollout. Distribution responsibilities were split by territory. Paramount Pictures handled the North American release, while Warner Brothers distributed the film across the remaining international markets, a division of labor that reflected the unusual, cross-studio financing arrangement that had brought the project to the screen in the first place. Globally, Interstellar ultimately reached more than 770 IMAX screens, at the time the largest IMAX release any film had ever received, a record that stood until Universal's Furious 7 surpassed it the following year with a release spanning 810 IMAX theaters. Interstellar's insistence on physical film projection ran directly counter to an industry-wide shift Paramount itself had been actively driving. The studio had, around this same period, been pursuing an explicit goal of phasing out film-based distribution altogether in favor of an all-digital release model, making Interstellar something of a deliberate exception carved out of the studio's own broader policy. Trade reporter Pamela McClintock, covering the release for The Hollywood Reporter, framed the decision to project Interstellar on physical film stock as an initiative aimed at helping preserve an endangered exhibition format that was rapidly disappearing from American theaters as digital conversion accelerated. That preservation effort found support beyond Nolan himself, drawing public backing from a notable cross-section of prominent filmmakers, including J.J. Abrams, Quentin Tarantino, Judd Apatow, and Paul Thomas Anderson, all of whom lent their names to the broader cause of keeping film projection viable as an option for future productions. Not everyone in the exhibition business welcomed the gesture, however. McClintock reported that many theater owners viewed the push to maintain and even temporarily reinstall film projection equipment as fundamentally regressive, given that the overwhelming majority of American theaters had already completed their conversion to digital projection and had little appetite for reversing course, even temporarily, for a single high-profile release. Coming back a decade later, Interstellar's theatrical life did not end with its initial 2014 run. 10 years after its original release, the film returned to theaters on December 6, 2024, for an anniversary re-release that played in both 70mm IMAX and standard digital formats, giving a new generation of viewers, as well as longtime fans, the chance to experience the film's large-format visuals in a genuine theatrical setting rather than through home streaming. The re-release performed strongly enough to register as a notable box office event in its own right, grossing $14 million worldwide over its opening weekend, a figure that pushed the film's cumulative lifetime global gross past $720 million. That anniversary run also allowed the film to cross a symbolic domestic milestone, pushing its United States box office total past $200 million for the first time. Taken together with subsequent weeks of continued theatrical play, the 10-year re-release went on to become the highest-grossing IMAX re-release of any film in history, accumulating $24.5 million worldwide by the time figures were tallied in late December 2024, a result that speaks to just how durable the appetite for seeing Interstellar specifically in large-format theatrical presentation has remained a full decade after its initial premiere. A campaign built on the same values as the film itself. Looking across the full arc of Interstellar's marketing and release strategy, a clear pattern emerges. Nearly every promotional decision mirrored a value embedded in the film's own content and production philosophy. Just as Nolan insisted on physical spacecraft miniatures and real 70mm film stock during production, Paramount insisted on physical film projection during release, treating the format itself as inseparable from the intended experience rather than a neutral delivery mechanism. Just as the film's story is built around genuine scientific consultation from Kip Thorne, its marketing extended that same credibility into publishing, commissioning an actual physics book from Thorne rather than settling for a conventional making of volume alone. And just as the film asks its characters to reach across vast distances of space and time to preserve a connection with the people they love, its marketing campaign asked audiences to reach into an emerging technology, virtual reality, still unfamiliar to most consumers in 2014, in order to feel physically present inside the endurance before ever buying a ticket. A decade later, the film's ability to draw audiences back into IMAX theaters for a limited anniversary run suggests that whatever combination of scientific rigor, emotional sincerity, and formal ambition Interstellar's marketing promised in 2014, enough of it has held up that audiences remain willing to experience it again, on the big screen, on its own terms. Interstellar's aggregate critical standing tells a story of respectable but not universal acclaim. On Rotten Tomatoes, roughly three-quarters of the several hundred critics tallied rated the film positively, landing it in the high 70s on the site's percentage scale with an average numerical score comfortably above the midpoint of a 10-point rating. The site's own critical summary framed the film as another example of the thrilling, intellectually engaged, and visually striking filmmaking audiences had come to associate with Nolan, while noting that its ideas ultimately reached further than its execution could fully support. Metacritic's tally of several dozen critics produced a broadly similar picture, landing in the mid-70s out of 100 and earning the site's generally favorable designation rather than its highest tier of acclaim. General audiences, polled through CinemaScore's exit survey methodology, responded somewhat more warmly than the critical consensus, awarding the film a grade in the upper range of the B tier, suggesting moviegoers who actually paid to see it left the theater more satisfied than the scattered critical reservations might imply. The case for Nolan's boldest swing. Among critics who embraced the film, a recurring theme was astonishment at its sheer ambition. Variety's chief film critic described Interstellar as among the most visually and conceptually daring work Nolan had yet produced, and found it notably more personal in tone than his earlier films, a reading that lines up with the film's unusually direct emotional register compared with the colder, puzzle box construction of movies like Inception. Empire's reviewer was similarly enthusiastic, awarding the film a perfect score and characterizing it as an intellectually dense yet visually gorgeous work that manages to marry genuine feeling with its scientific scaffolding rather than letting one undercut the other. Time Out London's critic likewise handed the film a top rating, describing it as an ambitious, visually striking journey through the cosmos carrying a dreamlike, almost surreal quality beneath its hard science fiction surface. The Chicago Sun-Times critic Richard Roper was similarly effusive, calling it among the most visually beautiful films he had ever encountered and singling out its central argument, that love may be the one force human beings intuitively understand but cannot reduce to a scientific measurement, as the emotional core that elevated it above a purely technical spectacle. Genre critic James Berardinelli went further than almost anyone else in his praise, describing the film as a remarkable achievement that functions simultaneously as a big-budget science fiction spectacle and a deceptively simple story about love and self-sacrifice, one that shifts between tension, wonder, hope, and heartbreak within the same running time. He later named it not merely the best film of that particular year but the second best film of the entire decade, arguing that it represented a return to genuine, idea-driven science fiction rather than the more commercially cautious, simplified version of the genre that mainstream studios typically produce. The Hollywood Reporter's Todd McCarthy offered a more measured but still favorable assessment, describing the film as a grandly conceived epic that attempts to give equal narrative weight to intimate human emotion and cosmic speculation, conceding that the results were mixed but never anything less than absorbing to watch. Writing for the Associated Press, critic Jake Coyle captured a similar duality, praising the film's large-scale, big-screen grandeur while acknowledging some awkwardness in its dialogue, ultimately landing on the judgment that it was an absurd, overreaching endeavor that nonetheless counted among the most transcendent films of its decade. Even critics who withheld a full endorsement often still found real virtues in individual elements of the production. The Telegraph's Tim Roby, describing Nolan as a filmmaker whose stock in trade is generating a sense of awe, argued that Interstellar came painfully close to greatness, singling out its conceptual daring and probing intelligence as evidence of just how near it came to fully succeeding. RogerEbert.com critic Matt Zola cites, a reviewer known for periodic frustration with Nolan's dialogue-heavy, formally rigid style, found that his usual objections gave way in the face of the film's sheer impact, comparing its tonal generosity to the warm, humane storytelling sensibility of a classic John Ford picture and describing it as a work that would rather attempt 8 or 9 different things at once than commit narrowly to just one. The case against, and the complaints in between. Other critics were considerably less forgiving. USA Today's Claudia Puich acknowledged the film's visual spectacle and the emotional weight of its underlying themes but felt the dialogue frequently fell flat and that stretches of the film set aboard the spacecraft dragged noticeably. The Guardian's Henry Barnes landed on a middling 3-star assessment, describing the film as a genuinely impressive spectacle wrapped around a comparatively thin drama, one populated by too few fully realized characters and too little levity. Australian television program At the Movies produced a rare instance of its two hosts splitting sharply on the same film. David Stratton rated it highly, praising its ambition, its effects work, and its 70mm IMAX presentation, though he found the sound mix so aggressively loud in places that dialogue became difficult to make out, while his co-host Margaret Pomeranz rated it considerably lower, feeling that the human drama at the story's center got buried beneath its scientific ideas. Forbes contributor Scott Mendelson took the most negative position of any prominent critic, placing Interstellar among the year's most disappointing releases despite watching it twice specifically to give the film a fair second chance. He argued that the film suffered from uneven pacing, lost momentum once its climax had passed, struggled with clumsy sound design, and ultimately rested on thinly drawn characters, concluding that beneath its scale and ambition it amounted to a stripped-down, somewhat muted variation on a familiar science fiction premise about a small crew venturing into space to save humanity. A filmmaker's filmmaker weighs in. Among the more unusual contributions to the film's critical conversation was an unscripted comment from director Quentin Tarantino, who was struck less by the film's plot mechanics than by its sheer sense of scale and its treatment of environment as an active dramatic presence. He remarked that it had been some time since a filmmaker had attempted something so expansive in vision, pointing specifically to the way the story's dust-choked setting overwhelms its characters' world so thoroughly that the effect reminded him of the atmospheric, elemental filmmaking associated with directors like Andrei Tarkovsky or Terrence Malick, a comparison he found surprising to make about what was ostensibly a science fiction adventure film rather than an art house drama. Reading the consensus. Surveying the range of critical opinion, the Los Angeles Times summarized the overall mood among reviewers as one of general agreement that Interstellar succeeded as an entertaining, emotionally engaged, and intellectually provocative science fiction epic, even while conceding that it could also feel clumsy or overly sentimental in places, a framing that captures how even the film's admirers rarely claimed it was flawless. That tension between grandeur and clumsiness, ambition and unevenness, runs through nearly every substantial review of the film, positive or negative, suggesting that Interstellar's reputation was always going to be built on the size of its swings rather than on any illusion of precision. Beyond the screen, science, faith, and cultural commentary. Some of the most interesting responses to Interstellar came not from film critics evaluating craft but from columnists and cultural critics interested in what the film was arguing about the relationship between different ways of understanding the world. New York Times columnist David Brooks read the film as an exploration of the connections between scientific reasoning and religious or spiritual faith, and separately between hard science and the humanities, concluding that the film illustrated a genuine, productive overlap between these supposedly opposed domains rather than treating them as inherently at odds. Writer Mark Steyn focused his commentary on the film's vision of a technological future filtered through its central father-daughter relationship, treating the Kupermuth bond as the emotional anchor that grounded the film's more speculative technological and cosmological material. Scholar Y.Chi Demock, writing in the Los Angeles Review of Books, offered a more theoretically inflected reading, describing Nolan's films generally as structures that can be examined and understood from multiple rotated vantage points, and arguing that Interstellar represents an unusual entry in the broader tradition of climate fiction storytelling precisely because of its considerable magical thinking, since it holds out hope that an ecological endpoint for the planet need not mean the end of everything, an optimism she suggested the film ultimately undercuts in its own conclusion once its more overtly poetic, less scientifically grounded choices become impossible to ignore. The verdict a decade later. Interstellar's reputation has continued to evolve well past its initial theatrical run, and if anything the passage of time has been kind to it. Steven Spielberg, the director originally attached to the project before Nolan took over, offered his own retrospective praise years later, acknowledging that the film had turned out better in Nolan's hands than he believed it would have in his own. Author George R.R. Martin offered one of the more striking comparisons made about the film, describing it as the most ambitious and demanding work of science fiction cinema since Stanley Kubrick's 2001, A Space Odyssey, placing it in direct lineage with a film many critics consider the genre's high-water mark. In 2020, Empire magazine included Interstellar among its ranking of the finest films made in the 21st century so far, a recognition that placed it alongside works from a much broader span of world cinema rather than judging it only against other studio science fiction releases. Reflecting on the film a decade after its release, Associated Press writer Lindsay Barr characterized its original reception as warm and largely successful, while acknowledging that it also drew genuine detractors at the time, and noted that its award season showing amounted to 5 Oscar nominations and a single win, all confined to technical and craft categories rather than the major prizes some had predicted it might contend for. Barr's larger point was that despite that comparatively modest awards haul, the film has since transformed into something closer to a beloved classic in the years since its release, a status confirmed in 2025 when it placed 89th on a New York Times ranking of the 100 best films of the 21st century, a list compiled from the votes of roughly 500 directors, actors, and other film industry professionals rather than from critics or general audiences alone. A film whose reputation outgrew its reviews. Taken as a whole, the critical record on Interstellar reveals a film whose initial reception undersold what it would eventually become in the cultural memory. The recurring complaints, clunky dialogue, and overstuffed final act, sound mixing that occasionally drowned out important lines, were real and were voiced by serious, careful critics rather than casual dismissals. But those same critics, almost without exception, paired their complaints with genuine admiration for the film's visual ambition, its emotional sincerity, and its willingness to risk looking foolish in pursuit of genuine awe, the exact quality Tarantino and others responded to so strongly.